The window unit air conditioner in the supervisor's office cycled on with a heavy, mechanical groan, producing a low shudder in the thin partition wall that separated the inner sanctums from the main clerk's room. It was early morning, the air in Birmingham already thick with the promise of a suffocating July heat, but inside the office of Conrad Hasley, the temperature was strictly regulated. Hasley sat at his mahogany desk, a man perfectly composed in a crisp seersucker suit, his posture straight, his breathing even. Before him lay the rezoning amendment file for the Eastern Industrial Corridor. He was reviewing the document with the methodical, unhurried precision that had defined his 14-year tenure as a senior city attorney. He did not rush. He did not make mistakes. Wallace Pruitt appeared in the doorway. Pruitt was 51 years old, a man whose entire existence seemed governed by an overwhelming desire to avoid notice. He carried with him the permanent, stale scent of pipe tobacco, though he never smoked within the walls of City Hall. He stood in the frame of the door, his shoulders slightly stooped, his hands clasped in front of his belt. He did not knock, but his presence was a disruption all the same. Hasley did not immediately look up. He finished reading the paragraph beneath his index finger, aligned the edge of the paper with the edge of the desk, and then raised his eyes. "Mr. Hasley," Pruitt said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the air conditioner. "I was reviewing the archive room access logs from the end of last week. It appears a junior clerk accessed the original survey files 3 days prior, during the lunch hour." Hasley's face remained a mask of polite, professional inquiry. He did not flinch. He did not sigh. Slowly, deliberately, he set his fountain pen down on the leather blotter. The silence in the room stretched, filled only by the rattling vibration of the window unit. Hasley understood immediately what this meant. The original survey contained the true coordinates, the baseline reality of the land before the amendment had been introduced. The amendment on his desk contained the altered coordinates. If someone had looked at the original, the discrepancy was no longer buried. The threat had materialized. "Which clerk?" Hasley asked. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Dorothea Oakes?" Pruitt replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. She was assigned the pre-council review for the amendment package. She checked out the original survey file on Tuesday. "I see," Hasley said softly. "Thank you, Wallace. That will be all." Pruitt nodded, clearly relieved to be dismissed from the bearer's burden of bad news, and retreated into the hallway. Hasley remained seated for a full minute. He looked at the pen on his desk. He looked at the amendment file. Then he stood up, buttoned the jacket of his seersucker suit, and walked out of his office. He moved through the corridors of City Hall with a quiet, gliding step. As he approached the rear of the building, the sharp, chemical smell of mimeograph fluid grew stronger. The window unit air conditioner in the supervisor's office cycled on with a heavy, mechanical groan, producing a low shudder in the thin partition wall that separated the inner sanctums from the main clerk's room. It was early morning, the air in Birmingham already thick with the promise of a suffocating July heat, but inside the office of Conrad Hasley, the temperature was strictly regulated. Hasley sat at his mahogany desk, a man perfectly composed in a crisp seersucker suit, his posture straight, his breathing even. Before him lay the rezoning amendment file for the Eastern Industrial Corridor. He was reviewing the document with the methodical, unhurried precision that had defined his 14-year tenure as a senior city attorney. He did not rush. He did not make mistakes. Wallace Pruitt appeared in the doorway. Pruitt was 51 years old, a man whose entire existence seemed governed by an overwhelming desire to avoid notice. He carried with him the permanent, stale scent of pipe tobacco, though he never smoked within the walls of City Hall. He stood in the frame of the door, his shoulders slightly stooped, his hands clasped in front of his belt. He did not knock, but his presence was a disruption all the same. Hasley did not immediately look up. He finished reading the paragraph beneath his index finger, aligned the edge of the paper with the edge of the desk, and then raised his eyes. "Mr. Hasley," Pruitt said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the air conditioner. "I was reviewing the archive room access logs from the end of last week. It appears a junior clerk accessed the original survey files 3 days prior, during the lunch hour." Hasley's face remained a mask of polite, professional inquiry. He did not flinch. He did not sigh. Slowly, deliberately, he set his fountain pen down on the leather blotter. The silence in the room stretched, filled only by the rattling vibration of the window unit. Hasley understood immediately what this meant. The original survey contained the true coordinates, the baseline reality of the land before the amendment had been introduced. The amendment on his desk contained the altered coordinates. If someone had looked at the original, the discrepancy was no longer buried. The threat had materialized. "Which clerk?" Hasley asked. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Dorothea Oakes?" Pruitt replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. She was assigned the pre-council review for the amendment package. She checked out the original survey file on Tuesday. "I see," Hasley said softly. "Thank you, Wallace. That will be all." Pruitt nodded, clearly relieved to be dismissed from the bearer's burden of bad news, and retreated into the hallway. Hasley remained seated for a full minute. He looked at the pen on his desk. He looked at the amendment file. Then he stood up, buttoned the jacket of his seersucker suit, and walked out of his office. He moved through the corridors of City Hall with a quiet, gliding step. As he approached the rear of the building, the sharp, chemical smell of mimeograph fluid grew stronger, a scent that permeated the air on filing days, clinging to the clothes and hair of the clerks who worked the machines. Hasley ignored it, pushing through the heavy oak door that led to the archive room. The room was windowless, illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a pale, sterile light over rows of green steel filing cabinets. Hasley walked directly to the section housing the county survey baselines. He pulled open the heavy drawer. The metal ball bearings hissed in the quiet room. He walked his fingers back through the hanging folders until he found the one marked for the eastern corridor. He pulled the file. He opened it. The original survey was there, perfectly intact. Nothing had been removed. The heavy, cream-colored paper bore the raised seal of the licensed surveyor. The coordinates were exactly as they had always been. Hasley closed the file and returned it to its precise place in the drawer. He pushed the drawer shut. A lesser man might have felt relief, assuming the clerk had merely glanced at the document and returned it without comprehension. Hasley was not a lesser man. He understood the architecture of bureaucracy. He left the archive room and walked 30 yards down the hallway to the small alcove where the department's photostat machine was housed. It was a massive, cumbersome piece of equipment, smelling of ozone and developer chemicals. Resting on the counter beside the machine was the heavy canvas-bound logbook. It was lying open. Hasley stepped up to the counter and looked down at the open pages. He traced his finger down the columns. Date, time, department, employee number, number of pages. He found the entry from 3 days prior, stamped in the late evening, hours after the office had officially closed. Employee number 408, 2 pages copied. Hasley's expression did not change. His jaw did not tighten. He simply reached out, closed the heavy canvas cover of the logbook, and slid it back into its designated slot on the shelf. The reality of the situation was now absolute. A copy existed. The numbers were out in the world. In the main clerk's room, the morning was already grinding forward in a symphony of typewriters, stamping machines, and the rustle of paper. Dorothea Oakes sat at her desk in the 3rd row, her back straight, her dark hair pinned tightly against her scalp in a style that allowed for no stray strands. She was a woman of precise habits, moving through her work with a quiet, rhythmic efficiency that made her largely invisible to the senior staff. This invisibility was a condition of her employment, a reality of being a black woman in a junior clerical role in Birmingham in 1971, and she utilized it as a tool. On her desk lay a stack of routine intake forms. She processed them one by one. She kept a small 6-inch wooden ruler in her top drawer, which she used to align the edges of the carbon copies before pressing down with her pen. The texture of the carbon paper was familiar beneath her fingertips, slightly waxy on the dark, coated side, rough and fibrous on the back. She aligned a form, pressed the ruler flat, and drew a sharp line. She reached toward her outbox to deposit the finished form and paused. Her eyes scanned the wooden tray. The amendment package for the Eastern Industrial Corridor, the thick manila folder she had prepared for pre-council review the previous afternoon, was no longer there. She had left it perfectly squared in the center of the tray at 5 o'clock. Dorothea did not gasp. She did not look around the room with wide eyes. She simply shifted her gaze, scanning the desks of the supervisory staff at the front of the room. There, resting on the corner of Wallace Pruitt's desk, was the thick manila folder. She looked back down at her intake forms. She aligned the next carbon copy with her ruler. She said nothing, but in the quiet, insulated space of her own mind, she began to count. She counted the hours since she had accessed the archive room. She counted the days since she had used the photostat machine. She calculated the exact window of time it would take for the access logs to be routed to Pruitt's desk for his weekly review. The timeline locked into place. They knew she had looked. At 10:15, the bell rang for the morning break. The clerks stood, stretching their legs, moving toward the break room or the elevators. Dorothea walked quietly to the women's restroom down the hall. The restroom was empty, smelling faintly of powdered soap and damp porcelain. The cool hexagonal tiles of the floor offered a brief respite from the growing heat of the building. Dorothea walked to the farthest sink, set her purse on the counter, and unclasped it. From the bottom of the bag, she withdrew a small newsprint crossword puzzle booklet. She opened the booklet to the middle pages. Folded neatly inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. She unfolded it and smoothed it flat against the counter. Written on the paper, in her own immaculate looping script, were the boundary coordinates she had transcribed from the original survey in the archive room 3 days ago. North 42 degrees, 15 minutes, 30 seconds east. Dorothea had a photographic memory for numbers. She did not need the paper to remember the coordinates. She knew the original baseline, and she knew the altered numbers printed on the amendment package. She knew the exact degree of the divergence. But she needed to look at the paper to feel the physical certainty of it. The numbers on the page were an anchor to reality in a building entirely constructed on the shifting sands of political convenience. She stared at the transcription for a full minute, tracing the line of ink with her eyes. The discrepancy was not a rounding error. It was not a surveyor's slight adjustment. It was a deliberate, calculated shift of a geographic boundary. Someone had moved a line on a map, and in doing so, they were preparing to move a massive, noise-polluting, heavy industrial metal stamping plant away from a white suburb and directly against the property lines of a black neighborhood. Dorothea refolded the paper along its original creases, tucked it back into the center of the crossword booklet, and returned the booklet to her purse. She checked her reflection in the mirror, smoothed the collar of her blouse, and walked back out into the hallway. Mid-morning, the window unit air conditioner in Hasley's office shuddered to life once more. Hasley sat behind his desk, his hands steepled beneath his chin. He pressed the button on his intercom. "Wallace, could you step in here for a moment?" A minute later, Pruitt appeared in the doorway, the faint smell of pipe tobacco preceding him. "Yes, Mr. Hasley?" "I've been reviewing the timeline for the council docket this week," Hasley said, his voice smooth, projecting nothing but administrative concern. "The Eastern Corridor amendment needs to be finalized for the agenda by Friday. I noticed it's currently sitting with Miss Oakes for pre-council review." "That is correct," Pruitt said cautiously. "She handles the bulk of the routine zoning amendments. Given the volume of intake forms we've seen this week, I think we need some workflow balancing," Hasley said. He did not look at Pruitt. He looked at the calendar on his desk. He did not mention Dorothea by name again. Let's reassign the amendment package to one of the senior clerks, someone who can expedite the final sign-offs without getting bogged down in the queue. Have it moved immediately. Pruitt blinked. He was a man who survived by understanding the subtext of his superiors without ever requiring them to speak it aloud. Workflow balancing. Yes, sir. I will reassign it to Mr. Miller. Thank you, Wallace, Hasley said. Pruitt returned to his desk. He took out a small pad of pink routing slips. He wrote Miller's name on the top line, checked the box for reassignment, and attached it to the manila folder. He did not ask questions. He did not wonder why a senior attorney was suddenly concerned with the specific desk assignment of a routine zoning file. He simply moved the paper. For Hasley, the action was a necessary first step in a broader containment strategy. By removing Dorothea from the paper trail, he was severing her official connection to the document. If she attempted to raise an alarm later, she would have no institutional standing. She would simply be a junior clerk speaking out of turn about a file she was no longer assigned to manage. At 11 o'clock, Dorothea rose from her desk to deliver a stack of processed intake forms to the central filing window. To get there, she had to pass the main corkboard where the daily routing memos were pinned. The frosted glass of the clerk's room window cast a flat, yellowish rectangle of light across the linoleum floor. Dorothea stepped into the light and paused before the board. Pinned to the cork was a fresh pink routing slip. She read the carbon-copied text. File, Eastern Corridor Rezoning Amendment. Reassigned to T. Miller. Reason, workflow balancing. Dorothea's expression remained perfectly neutral. She did not touch the memo. She simply marked the timing in her mind. 3 hours after Pruitt had checked the archive logs, the file was taken from her. The passive observation phase of her week was over. The machinery of the office was now actively moving against her. She understood that if she did nothing, the amendment would pass the council vote on Friday, the plant would be built, and the paper trail would be buried forever under the concrete of the new foundation. 3 weeks earlier. The City Hall building was entirely silent, the deep, hollow quiet that only descends on municipal buildings long after midnight. In his office, Conrad Hasley sat alone. The overhead fluorescent lights were off. Only the small brass desk lamp was illuminated, casting a tight pool of yellow light over the leather blotter. Hasley was in his shirt sleeves, his seersuckered jacket draped carefully over the back of his chair. On the desk before him lay the original survey document, retrieved from the archive room, and a blank official city rezoning amendment form. He worked in absolute silence. He held a drafting pen in his right hand. He looked at the coordinates on the original survey, the numbers that placed the industrial corridor safely against the edge of the Roebuck Park suburb. He calculated the necessary offset in his head, converting the minutes and seconds of the geographic grid, shifting the boundary exactly 3/4 of a mile to the southwest. He moved his pen to the blank amendment form. With deliberate, steady precision, he wrote the new numbers. He forged the boundary. He did not sweat. His hand did not shake. He was simply correcting a political problem through the silent friction of paper. His brother-in-law's financial stake in Caldwell Industrial required the plant to be built, and the city council member representing Roebuck Park had privately threatened to kill the zoning approval if the trucks ran through his district. The solution was elegant. Move the line. Collegeville had no representation on the zoning subcommittee. Collegeville would not notice until the bulldozers arrived. The heavy black rotary phone on his desk rang. The sound was violently loud in the silent office. Hasley's hand stopped. The pen hovered a millimeter above the paper. He stared at the phone. It rang a second time. A third. He did not answer it. He waited until the ringing stopped, the silence rushing back into the room to fill the void. Then he lowered his pen and finished writing the false coordinates. The act was complete. Shown without elaboration, without malice, simply a matter of administrative necessity. Return to present. The noon bell rang, signaling the lunch hour. The clerk's room emptied rapidly as staff headed to the cafeteria or out into the sweltering downtown streets. Dorothea remained at her desk. She unwrapped a small sandwich she had brought from home, but she did not eat it immediately. She reached down to the bottom drawer of her desk, the drawer reserved for personal items and reference materials. She pulled out a thick, spiral-bound city street index. It was a standard-issue map book, the kind used by the permitting department to verify addresses. She opened the book and laid it flat on her desk. She turned the pages until she found the eastern grid. She located the Collegeville neighborhood, a dense grid of small residential streets bounded by the railroad tracks to the north. Then she found the Roebuck Park area on the adjacent page. Dorothea took a bite of her sandwich, chewing slowly as she compared the map grid references to the coordinate difference she had memorized. She traced the original boundary with her fingernail, drawing an invisible line along the edge of the Roebuck Park map. Then she applied the offset, the false numbers written on the amendment. She moved her finger down and to the left, dragging the invisible line across the page until it came to rest directly against the rear property lines of the homes in Collegeville. The abstraction of the numbers vanished. The degrees, minutes, and seconds translated directly into dirt, into exhaust fumes, into the relentless concussive thud of heavy metal stamping presses operating 24 hours a day, 50 yards from children's bedrooms. She heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Smooth, gliding footsteps. Dorothea swiftly closed the street index and dropped it back into her bottom drawer, sliding it shut just as the door to the clerk's room opened. Conrad Hazley walked into the room. He was ostensibly returning a file to the intake window, holding a thin blue folder in his left hand. As he crossed the floor, the flat, yellowish rectangle of light from the frosted window, which had moved 2 inches across the linoleum since 11 o'clock, caught the edge of his seersucker suit. Dorothea pulled a stack of blank forms toward her and began typing on her manual Underwood machine. The clack, clack, clack of the keys filled the empty room. Hazley passed within 10 feet of her desk. He turned his head slightly, his eyes resting on her. He looked at the tight pins in her hair, the rigid posture of her back, the steady rhythm of her hands on the keys. Dorothea saw him in her peripheral vision. She felt the weight of his gaze. She did not look up. She did not break the rhythm of her typing. She hit the carriage return, the bell dinging sharply, and continued to the next line. Hazley continued past her, depositing the file at the window, and walked out the opposite door. It was a brief, entirely silent non-encounter, but in that moment, the architecture of their conflict was fully established. Both characters had registered the other's awareness. Neither had acknowledged it. The game was locked. At 3 o'clock, the atmosphere in the clerk's room was thick and lethargic, the window unit air conditioners struggling against the peak afternoon heat. Wallace Pruitt stood up from his desk and cleared his throat. "Miss Oakes," he called out, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the typewriters. "Could you step up here, please?" Dorothea placed her pen down, aligned it parallel to her wooden ruler, and walked to the front of the room. She stood before Pruitt's desk. The smell of pipe tobacco was heavy here, mixed with the scent of old paper and nervous sweat. Pruitt did not look her in the eye. He looked at a single sheet of paper resting on his blotter. "Miss Oakes," he said, his tone overly formal. "In reviewing the archive access logs, I noted that you visited the room after hours on Tuesday evening." "I did," Dorothea said evenly. She offered no explanation. She knew the rule of bureaucracy: never volunteer information that has not been explicitly requested. "The protocol for the archive room," Pruitt continued, tracing the edge of the paper with his thumb, "requires a supervisor co-signature for any visits conducted outside of standard operating hours. It is an insurance matter, for the integrity of the files." He slid the paper across the desk toward her. It was a standard retroactive access authorization form. The date and time of her Tuesday evening visit were already filled in. The box for reason for access was left blank. Dorothea looked at the form. She understood exactly what this was. Hasley was not just removing her from the paper trail of the amendment, he was building a new paper trail against her. By signing this form, she was officially documenting her presence in the archive room at the exact time the photostat machine had been used. She was putting her head in the noose. But to refuse to sign it would be insubordination. It would give them immediate grounds for termination before she had secured any institutional backing. Dorothea picked up the pen resting on Pruitt's desk. She read the form carefully, ensuring there was no hidden language regarding the removal or copying of documents. It was a simple access log. She leaned over and signed her name on the bottom line in her immaculate script. She handed the form back to Pruitt. "Thank you, Miss Oakes," Pruitt said, quickly taking the paper and sliding it into a manila folder. He filed it without comment. "You're welcome, Mr. Pruitt," Dorothea said. She turned and walked back to her desk. Both of them understood that a trap had just been set, and that she had willingly stepped into it. At 5:15, the municipal offices closed. Dorothea left the City Hall building and walked 3 blocks to the bus stop on 19th Street. The heat radiating from the pavement was intense, shimmering in the late afternoon sun. She boarded the northbound bus, taking a seat near the back, and rode in silence as the dense commercial architecture of downtown gave way to the industrial fringes and finally to the residential grid of Collegeville. She stepped off the bus at the corner of 32nd Avenue. She did not go to her own apartment. Instead, she walked down the block, passing the small, neatly kept houses with their deep front porches. She walked past her mother's house, a single-story frame house painted a faded yellow. She did not stop to go inside. She continued to the end of the street, walking down the narrow dirt alleyway that ran behind the residential lots. She stopped at the rear edge of her mother's property, where the chain-link fence marked the boundary between the neighborhood and a vast, overgrown open field. Dorothea stood at the fence line. She gripped the warm metal of the chain link with both hands. She stood there long enough for the ambient sounds of the neighborhood to wash over her, filtering through the humid air. She heard the high, bright voices of children playing tag 2 streets over. She heard the sharp, rhythmic thwack of a wooden screen door slamming shut on a nearby porch. From an open window to her left, the faint, tinny sound of a radio broadcast drifted out. A gospel station playing a slow, mournful hymn. She looked out across the open field. The tall grass swayed slightly in the hot breeze. She measured the distance with her eyes. 50 yards. That was the distance from the fence line to the edge of the newly altered corridor. If the amendment passed on Friday, this field would be leveled. The grass would be replaced by a massive concrete pad. The sounds of the children, the screen doors, the radio would be entirely obliterated by the deafening, earth-shaking crash of industrial stamping presses. The air would taste of metallic dust. The neighborhood would be slowly, methodically, choked to death. She looked at the distance to the nearest property line. She saw the reality of the numbers she held in her memory. She let go of the fence, turned around, and walked back up the alley. That evening, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, offering a slight reprieve from the heat. Dorothea sat in the small front room of her own apartment, 3 miles closer to the city center. The room was dark. She had not turned on the lamps. She walked to the small wooden bookshelf against the wall. From the bottom shelf, she pulled out a thick, leather-bound hymnal. She opened it to the back cover. Tucked inside were 2 large, stiff sheets of photostat paper, the copies she had made 3 days ago. The cover sheet of the original survey, and the boundary specification page. The physical proof of the lie. She took the 2 pages and walked into her small kitchen. She opened a drawer and retrieved a plain brown envelope and a roll of heavy adhesive tape. She slid the photostat pages into the envelope and sealed the flap tightly. She pulled out one of the wooden chairs from her kitchen table. She sat on the floor, sliding herself under the table. Reaching up, she pressed the envelope flat against the rough, unfinished wood of the table's underside, directly behind the front drawer casing. She tore off 4 long strips of tape and secured the envelope firmly in place. It was completely invisible unless someone were to lie on the floor and look upward. She slid out from under the table and stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt. She walked over to her purse, resting on the counter. She opened it and checked the crossword puzzle booklet. The handwritten transcription of the coordinates was still folded safely inside. The 2 pieces of evidence were now separated. If they searched her desk at work, they would find nothing. If they searched her purse, they would find only her own handwriting, easily dismissed as a clerk's error. If they searched her apartment, they would have to dismantle the furniture to find the official copy. She was securing her leverage, preparing for the moment she would need to use it. Across the city, in the quiet, affluent enclave of Mountain Brook, Conrad Hasley sat at the polished granite island of his kitchen. The house was silent, heavily insulated against the outside world. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up precisely to the elbows. On the counter in front of him sat a simple glass of ice water. Condensation beaded on the outside of the glass, pooling slowly on the stone. Hasley did not drink. He sat perfectly still, running through the architecture of the problem in his mind. He categorized the facts with cold, legal detachment. Fact 1. The photostat copy existed. 2 pages, the cover sheet and the boundary specifications. Fact 2. Dorothea Oakes had made the copy. The access logs and the machine timestamps confirmed it. Fact 3. Her visit to the archive room was now officially documented, signed by her own hand, creating a record of unauthorized access. Fact 4. The amendment package had been reassigned, severing her official connection to the file and isolating her from the process. He picked up his fountain pen from the counter. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. She had not spoken. She had not raised an alarm. This meant she was either too frightened to act, or she was waiting for the right moment. Hasley did not believe in leaving variables to chance. If she was waiting, he needed to remove her ability to speak entirely. He needed to destroy her credibility before she could open her mouth. He pressed his thumb against the cap of the pen. Click. He needed leverage. He needed a mechanism to remove her from City Hall permanently, with cause, so that any subsequent accusation she made would look like the bitter retaliation of a fired employee. Click. The unauthorized access was a start, but it was a procedural violation, not a fatal blow. He needed to look deeper. He needed to find the pressure point. Click. Hasley set the pen down next to the glass of water. The decision was made. Tomorrow morning, before the heat of the day set in, his next step would be to pull her employment record from the personnel office. He would find the flaw, and he would break her with it. The personnel notice lay perfectly square in the center of Dorothea Oakes's desk. It was printed on the standard pale yellow paper the city reserved for administrative actions, a color designed to be easily spotted in a stack of white intake forms. The overhead fluorescent lights of the main clerk's room in the Birmingham Planning and Zoning Office cast a flat, sterile glare across the paper, illuminating the heavy black typeface of the header. Dorothea did not pick it up. She sat in her wooden chair, her posture perfectly straight, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her blotter. She read the text exactly where it lay. The language was bureaucratic, stripped of emotion, yet entirely clear in its intent. It was a formal notification of an administrative review regarding her employment status, citing a pending inquiry into procedural irregularities. It did not mention the archive room. It did not mention the original survey for the Eastern Industrial Corridor. It did not mention Conrad Hasley. It did not have to. She read the notice a second time, her eyes tracking the lines with the steady, mechanical precision of a typewriter carriage. Her breathing did not change. Her expression remained a mask of quiet concentration. She possessed a photographic memory for numbers and a highly disciplined mind for patterns. She understood immediately that this piece of paper was not a warning. It was the beginning of a termination process. Hasley was building the paper trail required to remove her from the building. Across the aisle, a senior clerk named Beatrice paused in her sorting. The rhythmic thud of her date stamp hovered in the air. Beatrice looked at the yellow slip on Dorothea's desk, then looked at Dorothea's face. "Is everything all right, Dorothea?" Beatrice asked, her voice pitched low enough to avoid carrying to the supervisor's glass-walled office at the front of the room. Dorothea opened her top right drawer. She took out her small, wooden, 6-inch ruler. With deliberate care, she aligned the edge of the ruler with the edge of the yellow personnel notice, sliding the paper smoothly across the desk and letting it drop into the open drawer. She closed the drawer with a soft click. "It is a paperwork matter," Dorothea said. She spoke in complete, measured sentences, her voice betraying nothing. "A routing update from the personnel office." Beatrice held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer, nodded once, and returned to her stamping. Dorothea turned her attention to the stack of intake forms waiting in her inbox. She picked up her pen, but her mind was no longer in the room. She was retreating into the architecture of the filing system, building a timeline in her head. She worked entirely from memory, writing nothing down, staring at a carbon copy application for a residential variance, while the dates and timestamps of the past 2 months arranged themselves in her mind. 14 months ago, Conrad Hasley had been assigned as the lead city attorney for the Caldwell Industrial rezoning application. 6 weeks ago, the original corridor survey, drafted by a licensed county surveyor, had been filed in the archive room. That survey placed the new metal stamping plant adjacent to the Roebuck Park suburb. 3 weeks ago, the amendment had appeared. Hasley had drafted it, altering the boundary coordinates so the corridor shifted away from Roebuck Park and ran directly against the property lines of the Collegeville neighborhood, a neighborhood that was predominantly black, working class, and already choking on the particulate air and truck traffic of the city's outward industrial expansion. Hasley had bypassed the standard attorney review step, citing a deadline, and dropped the amendment directly into the filing queue. But an amendment did not process itself. It had to be logged. It had to be checked against the original file to ensure the parcel identification numbers matched. Dorothea calculated the dates. 2 weeks ago, the amendment had entered the active queue. She had not been assigned to the pre-council review rotation at that time. She visualized the duty roster from 2 weeks prior, a grid of names and dates she had glanced at only once but remembered perfectly. Wallace Pruitt had been the intake clerk on duty. Dorothea's pen hovered over the residential variance form. Pruitt was 51 years old. He had worked in the zoning office for 19 years. He was a man cautious to the point of paralysis, a man whose entire professional existence was dedicated to processing the week's filing queue without incident, so he could retire in 4 years with his pension intact. If Pruitt was the intake clerk, he had to have pulled the original survey to verify the amendment. He had to have seen the coordinate discrepancy. The numbers were drastically different. The directional offset was impossible to miss for anyone trained to read a parcel map. Pruitt had seen it, and Pruitt had filed the amendment anyway, passing it through without a single note of discrepancy. She now knew that Pruitt saw it first. Dorothea needed to confirm this. She needed to know how deep Pruitt's fear ran, because a frightened man was a predictable man. She selected a thick manila folder from her outbox, a routine commercial zoning application that required a supervisor's signature for cross-departmental routing. She stood up, smoothed the skirt of her dress, and walked toward the front of the room. Pruitt's desk sat just outside the glass-walled supervisor's office. As Dorothea approached, the familiar, heavy smell of pipe tobacco reached her. Pruitt did not smoke in the building, but the scent was woven into the fabric of his suits, a sweet, stale odor that preceded him everywhere. He was hunched over a stack of requisitions, a pencil gripped tightly in his right hand. "Mr. Pruitt," Dorothea said quietly. Pruitt flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden stiffening of the shoulders, but Dorothea saw it. He looked up, his eyes darting to the folder in her hands and then to her face. "Yes, Miss Oakes, what is it?" "I have a routing question regarding the commercial variance for the South Side property," Dorothea said, keeping her tone entirely deferential. The applicant has requested a secondary review by the sanitation board, but the primary intake lacks the necessary cross-departmental stamp. As she spoke, she watched his hands. Pruitt's left hand remained resting on his blotter. His right hand, still holding the pencil, moved with a slow, seemingly casual slide across his desk, coming to rest squarely over a closed blue folder. He pressed his palm flat against the cardboard cover. Dorothea noted the movement. She did not look at the folder. She kept her eyes on his face. "Leave it in the secondary tray," Pruitt said, his voice slightly thinner than usual. "I will review the routing protocols this afternoon." "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt," Dorothea said. She turned and walked back to her desk. She did not yet know what specific document he was covering, but she knew he was covering something. His physical reaction confirmed her timeline. Pruitt was actively managing his own exposure. He knew the amendment was fraudulent. He knew Hasley had submitted it, and he was terrified of being caught in the blast radius. By 10:30, the heavy, humid heat of the Birmingham morning had begun to press against the tall windows of the clerk's room. The rhythmic clatter of typewriters provided a steady baseline of noise. Dorothea was halfway through a stack of permit renewals when the heavy wooden door at the front of the office opened. A courier stepped into the room. He wore a dark blue uniform and carried a thick, sealed envelope. He walked directly to the intake window, his heavy footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Through the brass grille of the window, Dorothea watched the exchange. The courier slid the envelope across the counter. Pruitt stood up from his desk and intercepted it before the junior clerk working the window could reach for it. Pruitt looked at the return address printed in the upper left corner of the envelope. Even from 30 feet away, Dorothea could see the tension in Pruitt's jaw. He did not open the envelope. He did not log it in the master intake ledger. Instead, he walked back to his desk and placed the envelope face down in the low priority tray, a wire basket reserved for misdirected mail and requests that were destined to be delayed indefinitely. Dorothea glanced at the large clock on the wall. It was 10:42. She knew exactly what was in the envelope. Reverend Matthias Cobb had begun his push. The envelope contained a formal public records request for the filed amendment, a document Cobb was legally entitled to view. The fact that Pruitt intercepted it personally meant that the office was already managing Cobb. Hasley had likely given standing orders to flag any inquiries from Greater Shiloh Baptist Church or the Collegeville community leadership. They were trying to stall the Reverend until the city council ratified the rezoning at the end of the week. At noon, the clerk's room emptied as the staff took their staggered lunch breaks. Dorothea retrieved her purse from her bottom drawer. She walked out of City Hall, stepping into the blinding glare of the midday sun. The heat radiating from the concrete sidewalks was oppressive, thick with the smell of exhaust from the passing buses. She walked 2 blocks east, moving away from the government district, until she reached a row of commercial storefronts. Tucked against the brick wall of a pharmacy was a public payphone. Dorothea opened her purse and took out a dime. She stepped into the narrow booth. The texture of the payphone receiver was intimately familiar to anyone who relied on public infrastructure. Smooth plastic worn to a dull gloss at the mouthpiece from years of use, faintly cool against her cheek in the sweltering heat. She dialed a number she had memorized the previous evening. The line rang 3 times before a woman answered. "Greater Shiloh," the voice said. "Sister Margaret, this is Dorothea Oakes," she said. "Dorothea, I was wondering if you might call." The deacon's voice was warm but guarded. In 1971, in this city, conversations over telephone lines regarding city business were always conducted with a layer of careful abstraction. "I'm calling regarding the matter Reverend Cobb mentioned to you," Dorothea said. "I need to understand the origin of the information. Has the Reverend spoken to anyone at the county level about the corridor?" "Not directly," the deacon replied, her voice dropping a fraction in volume. The Reverend heard it from a brother in the county permitting office. "The word is that the city council member who sits on the zoning subcommittee had a private meeting with the project manager from Caldwell Industrial." A closed-door meeting, about a month ago. The assumption is that the council member ordered the shift to protect the Roebuck Park property values, and the zoning office just pushed the paper. Dorothea listened closely. She analyzed the logic of the rumor. It was a plausible narrative. It was exactly how business was traditionally conducted in Birmingham, a quiet conversation between a white councilman and a corporate manager, resulting in a sudden, unexplained burden placed on a black neighborhood. "I understand," Dorothea said. She did not write anything down. Her mind catalogued the dates, the names, the sequence of assumed events. "Thank you, Sister Margaret. Please tell the Reverend I will come to the church this evening." "Be careful, Dorothea," the deacon said. "I will." Dorothea hung up the receiver. She stood in the booth for a moment, listening to the hum of the traffic. The false lead was taking shape. Cobb believed the corruption originated with the city council. If Cobb attacked the council member without proof, Hasley would simply step back and let the councilman take the political heat, while the amendment quietly passed the final vote. Hasley was insulated. She needed to check the subcommittee records. Dorothea returned to City Hall at 12:45. The office was still quiet. She walked past her desk and proceeded to the rear of the room, where the public meeting minutes were stored on a long row of reinforced steel shelving. She located the heavy, leather-bound binders for the zoning subcommittee. As she pulled the volume for the current year from the shelf, the smell of old paper and rubber band dust rose into the air, a dry, slightly sweet odor that Dorothea associated with documents no one had touched in months. It was the smell of bureaucratic stagnation. She carried the heavy binder to a reading table and opened it. For the next hour, she read every entry for the past 6 months. She did not skim. She read with a meticulous, unyielding focus that made her the most accurate clerk in the department. She checked the attendance logs, the public comment records, the motions to table, and the executive session summaries. She found no formal record of contact between the council member and Caldwell Industrial. There were no recorded meetings, no logged correspondence, no public hearings regarding the corridor shift. But on a Tuesday in late April, approximately 5 weeks before the amendment was filed, she found a small, seemingly insignificant notation in the attendance record of a routine subcommittee meeting. Present as legal counsel, C. Hasley. Dorothea stopped reading. She stared at the typed name. Hasley was a senior city attorney. He did not routinely attend low-level zoning subcommittee meetings, unless he was specifically requested to brief the members on a complex legal liability. Furthermore, Dorothea remembered the master public calendar posted on the corkboard in the supervisor's office. She had looked at it every day for months. Hasley's calendar for that Tuesday in April had listed him as being in a deposition for a municipal transit lawsuit. The discrepancy was small. To anyone else, it would look like a simple scheduling overlap. To Dorothea, it was a structural fracture. Hasley had been in a room with the zoning subcommittee members off his official schedule, right before the original survey was finalized, and right before he drafted the fraudulent amendment. Dorothea opened her purse. She took out a small, folded crossword puzzle booklet. Inside the booklet was the handwritten transcription of the original boundary coordinates she had made days ago. She turned to a page containing a completed puzzle. In the narrow white margin beside the clues, she wrote the date of the subcommittee meeting and Hasley's name in tiny, precise letters. She closed the booklet and returned it to her purse. At 3 o'clock, the telephone on Pruitt's desk rang once. He answered it, listened for a few seconds, and hung up. He stood and looked across the room at Dorothea. He gestured for her to come over. Dorothea aligned the edges of the files on her desk, stood, and walked to the front of the room. Pruitt did not ask her to sit. He remained standing behind his desk. He picked up a small square of paper. He did not meet her eyes. He looked at the knot of his own tie, then at the wall behind her. "Miss Oakes," Pruitt said, his voice tight, "effective this coming Monday, you are being reassigned from the pre-council review rotation. You will report to the archive maintenance desk." Archive maintenance was a position typically given to new hires or clerks being disciplined. It involved dusting the rolling shelves, replacing torn manila folders, and retyping faded index cards. It was a demotion in all but title. It removed her entirely from the flow of active documents. Dorothea looked at the piece of paper in his hand. "Is this reassignment connected to the personnel review notice I received this morning, Mr. Pruitt?" Pruitt swallowed. He shifted his weight. "Administrative decisions are separate processes, Miss Oakes. Workflow balancing requires adjustments. You will begin your new duties on Monday." He was reciting a script. Hazley had given him the order, and Pruitt was executing it to protect himself. By moving her to the archives, Hazley was isolating her, cutting off her access to the amendment package and the daily intake logs. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt," Dorothea said. She kept her voice perfectly level. She did not argue. She did not show anger. She simply accepted the instruction and turned away. As she walked back to her desk, she felt the eyes of the room on her. The other clerks had heard the exchange. The office ecosystem was highly sensitive to shifts in power, and Dorothea had just been publicly downgraded. She sat down, picked up her pen, and resumed her work. At 5 o'clock, the office closed. Dorothea left City Hall, but she did not walk toward the bus stop that would take her home. Instead, she walked 4 blocks north, crossing the invisible boundary that separated the municipal government buildings from the county administration district. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a massive, imposing structure of pale limestone, its architecture heavier and more severe than City Hall. Dorothea climbed the wide stone steps and entered the building. The air inside was cooler, smelling of floor wax and old brass. She navigated the echoing hallways until she found the door marked County Surveyor, Public Records. She stepped inside. The room was dominated by a long, scarred wooden counter. Behind the counter, a young white clerk in a short-sleeved shirt was locking a cash box. Dorothea approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said. The clerk looked up, clearly eager to leave. "Office is closed." "I only have a procedural question," Dorothea said, her tone polite and professional. "May the public view filed parcel survey documents here, or is a formal requisition required?" The clerk sighed, leaning against the counter. "Public can view any filed parcel map, but we don't pull files after 4:30. You have to come back tomorrow." "What time does the public counter open?" 8 o'clock sharp, the clerk said, grabbing his keys. "Thank you," Dorothea said. She noted the time. She had identified the county survey office as a resource. The county held the baseline data. If Hazley had altered the city's amendment, the county's master map would prove it. But she could not access it tonight. She left the courthouse and walked to the bus stop. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the streets. She rode the bus to the eastern edge of the city, stepping off in a neighborhood where the pavement was cracked and the air tasted faintly of sulfur from the distant foundries. She walked 3 blocks to Greater Shiloh Baptist Church. It was a modest brick building, its white wooden doors propped open to catch the evening breeze. Dorothea bypassed the main sanctuary and walked around to the side entrance, descending a short flight of concrete stairs into the basement administrative offices. Reverend Matthias Cobb's office was small and crowded with books. The sound of a window fan dominated the room, an oscillating metal fan that clicked faintly at each rotation, marking the silence between sentences. Cobb sat behind a heavy oak desk. He was a large man, slow-moving, with a face lined by years of navigating the treacherous waters of Birmingham politics. He had been present at several city council meetings in the 1960s, demanding basic municipal services for black neighborhoods, and had been physically removed from one by police. He did not trust the city. He trusted documents, because documents, once secured, could not change their testimony. A yellow legal pad sat perfectly centered on his desk. "Dorothea," Cobb said, his deliberate baritone cutting through the hum of the fan. "Sit down." Dorothea sat in the wooden chair across from him. She placed her purse on her lap. "Sister Margaret said you called?" Cobb said. He picked up a fountain pen. "Tell me what you have." "I have seen the original survey for the Caldwell Industrial Corridor," Dorothea said, her voice steady. "And I have seen the rezoning amendment that is scheduled for a council vote this Friday. The boundary coordinates are different." Cobb's eyes narrowed slightly. He did not ask how she had seen them. He did not ask if she was sure. He simply opened his legal pad. "Say the numbers," Cobb said. Dorothea closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, accessing the visual image of the documents she had stored in her mind. "The original survey boundary line," she recited, "begins at point 33 degrees, 32 minutes, 14 seconds north, 86 degrees, 45 minutes, 10 seconds west. It proceeds along a vector of—" She recited the entire sequence of the original boundary, her voice an unbroken stream of precise data. Cobb wrote furiously, his pen scratching across the paper. "The amendment," Dorothea continued, "alters the starting point to 33 degrees, 31 minutes, 45 seconds north, 86 degrees, 44 minutes, 50 seconds west. The directional offset shifts the entire corridor approximately 3/4 of a mile south-southeast." Cobb stopped writing. He looked at the numbers on his pad. He understood geography. He knew exactly what that shift meant. "South-southeast," Cobb murmured, "away from Roebuck Park, right against the back lots of Collegeville." "Yes," Dorothea said. She did not tell him she had a photostat copy of the original survey hidden in an envelope taped to the underside of her kitchen table drawer. She did not show him the handwritten transcription in her purse. She needed to ensure Cobb was operating on the correct assumptions before she handed over the physical evidence. "Sister Margaret told me the rumor," Dorothea said. "About the city council member meeting with the Caldwell project manager?" Cobb nodded slowly. "A man in county permitting told one of my deacons. It makes sense. The councilman's district includes Roebuck Park. He wants the plant's tax revenue, but he doesn't want the noise and the trucks in his white neighborhoods. So he meets with Caldwell, they agree to shift the line, and the zoning office pushes the paper through." Dorothea looked at the oscillating fan. It clicked, sweeping a current of warm air across her face. "I do not believe the change originated with the council member," Dorothea said. Cobb frowned. "Why?" "Because of the timeline," Dorothea explained. "The rumor states the closed-door meeting occurred a month ago, but the amendment was submitted to the filing queue 3 weeks ago, and it bypassed the standard attorney review step. Furthermore, the amendment predates the zoning subcommittee meeting where the corridor was officially discussed. If the council member ordered the change, there would be a paper trail of a directive from his office to the planning department. There is none. The amendment was generated internally by the lead city attorney." Cobb paused. He set his pen down. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic click of the fan. He stared at Dorothea, his mind recalibrating. He had assumed the standard political corruption, an elected official protecting his voters at the expense of the disenfranchised. But Dorothea was describing something much more dangerous. She was describing a unilateral falsification of public records by a senior attorney. "Conrad Hazley," Cobb said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Yes," Dorothea said. "If Hazley altered the coordinates himself," Cobb said, leaning forward, "and submitted it as a legitimate amendment, that is fraud. That is a criminal act." "It is," Dorothea agreed. "But he is a senior attorney, and I am a junior clerk. If I accuse him, he will say I misread the technical documents. He has already initiated a personnel review to terminate my employment. He is building a case that I am incompetent and insubordinate." Cobb looked at the legal pad. The false lead had collapsed. The enemy was not a politician who could be shamed in the press. The enemy was the architect of the city's legal framework, a man who controlled the very documents that would prove his guilt. "We need a lawyer," Cobb said decisively. "Not a city lawyer, a civil rights attorney." I know a man who has handled municipal records cases before. He understands how these people operate."
"How long will it take to bring him in?"
Dorothea asked. "I need 2 days," Cobb said. "I have to brief him, and he has to review the statutes regarding public records."
"I agree to 2 days,"
Dorothea said. "But you must promise me something, Reverend."
"What?"
"Do not approach the zoning office directly. Do not send any more couriers. Do not call Mr. Pruitt. Hasley is watching the intake logs. If he knows you are actively pulling at the thread, he will accelerate the council vote, or he will find a way to destroy the original survey in the archive room." Cobb looked at her with a mixture of respect and deep concern. "I will stay away from the office. But Dorothea, if Hasley is already moving against your employment, you are in the line of fire." "I know," she said simply. She stood up. "I will contact you in 2 days." Dorothea left the church and began the walk home. The early dark had settled over Birmingham. The street lights flickered on, casting pools of yellow light on the cracked sidewalks. The air was thick with humidity and the distant mechanical hum of the city's industrial heart. She walked with purpose, her flat-soled shoes making quiet, rhythmic sounds on the pavement. She lived in a modest apartment building on the edge of the district, a transitional neighborhood where the streetlights were often broken and the police rarely patrolled unless called. As she turned onto the block before her building, she slowed her pace. Parked halfway down the street, under the direct glare of a functioning streetlight, was a dark 4-door sedan. It was an unremarkable car, the kind favored by mid-level municipal managers. But as Dorothea approached, her eyes caught a flash of color on the dashboard. It was a standard blue and white card, the size of a playing card. A City Hall parking permit. Dorothea's heart executed a single, hard thud against her ribs. The permit was clearly visible under the streetlight. It was not a mistake. It was a message. Hasley, or someone working for him, was sitting in the dark, watching her building. She did not stop walking. She did not break her stride. She did not turn her head to look at the driver's seat. She maintained the exact same pace, her face a mask of total indifference, projecting the image of a tired clerk returning from a long day. The discipline of fear held her spine rigid. For the 2 seconds it took to pass the vehicle, she focused entirely on the cracks in the sidewalk ahead of her. She reached her building, unlocked the heavy wooden front door, and climbed the 2 flights of stairs to her apartment. She unlocked her own door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. She threw the deadbolt. She engaged the chain. She did not turn on the front room light. Dorothea stood in the dark, listening to the silence of her apartment. She walked slowly into the kitchen, guided by the ambient light filtering through the window blinds. She knelt on the linoleum floor and reached under the small wooden kitchen table. Her fingers brushed against the rough wood until they found the edge of the envelope she had taped there the night before. The envelope was still there. The photostat copy was safe. She sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, her purse resting on her lap, her hand resting on the crossword booklet that held the numbers that could tear the city's plans apart. The following morning, before the heat of the day had fully established itself, Conrad Hasley sat in a leather chair in the director's office of the Birmingham Municipal Personnel Department. He wore a pristine seersucker suit, the fabric crisp and unwrinkled. His posture was relaxed, his legs crossed at the knee. He held his silver fountain pen in his right hand. Across the desk, the personnel officer, a balding man with a nervous disposition, was reviewing a single sheet of paper. "Mr. Hasley," the officer said, clearing his throat, "this is a formal recommendation for termination. The grounds listed are unauthorized archive access and conduct unbecoming a city employee." "That is correct," Hasley said. His voice was quiet, smooth, and entirely devoid of malice. It was the voice of a man discussing a minor plumbing repair. "Miss Oakes has no prior disciplinary history," the officer noted, looking at a thin file folder on his desk. "In fact, her accuracy ratings are the highest in the clerk's pool." Technical proficiency does not excuse procedural violations, Hasley said smoothly. The zoning archive contains sensitive legal documents. We cannot have junior clerks accessing restricted files outside of operating hours without authorization. It is a liability issue for the city. Hasley clicked the cap of his pen. Once. I understand, the officer said quickly, but standard procedure dictates that a termination recommendation of this nature must be routed through the department head for a signature before we can process the final paperwork. Hasley smiled. It was a small, tight expression that did not reach his eyes. He leaned forward and placed the tip of his pen on the signature line of the form. He signed his name with fluid, elegant strokes. Do not concern yourself with the routing, Hasley said, capping the pen and sliding the paper back across the desk. I will handle the department head myself. Just prepare the final notice. Hasley stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the office. The machinery was in motion. He had isolated her, he had frightened her, and now he was going to remove her entirely. By the time the city council called the rezoning vote to order, Dorothea Oakes would be a disgruntled former employee with a documented history of misconduct, and her words would mean absolutely nothing. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a structure of heavy limestone and polished terrazzo, built to project an authority that was entirely indifferent to the people who moved through its halls. At 7:30 in the morning, before the public doors were unlocked, the building possessed a hollow, echoing quiet. Dorothea Oakes sat in a hard-backed wooden chair in the survey office on the third floor, her hands folded perfectly in her lap. She was waiting. Across the wide drafting table sat Sylvia Brandt. Brandt was a woman in her mid-30s with a wiry, kinetic frame and a face that seemed perpetually braced for an argument. She did not offer coffee. She did not ask how Dorothea's morning had been. She simply unrolled a massive, heavy stock parcel map across the table, anchoring the corners with brass weights, and placed a copy of the city's rezoning amendment directly on top of it. Brandt held a silver mechanical pencil in her right hand. Without preamble, she brought the tip of the pencil down against the surface of the parcel map. Tap. Here is the county baseline, Brandt said, her voice quick and clipped, using the technical language of her profession without any attempt to soften it for a layman. Established in 1968, verified by 2 independent field teams, it is the absolute geographic truth of the Eastern Corridor. She moved the pencil to the city amendment document resting on top of the map. Tap. And here are the boundary coordinates submitted by the City Planning Office for the Caldwell Industrial Site. Brandt looked up, her eyes locking onto Dorothea's. The offset is consistent, and it is directional. It moves the entire eastern boundary line precisely 420 yards to the south-southwest. Dorothea looked at the numbers. She did not need to read them. She had them memorized, locked in her mind with photographic clarity. It is not a drafting error, Dorothea said quietly. It was not a question. Drafting errors are chaotic, Brandt said, the mechanical pencil tapping a light, dry rhythm against the map's surface, a sound that carried sharply in the quiet of the office before public hours. A draftsman transposes a number, drops a decimal, misreads a minute for a second. When that happens, the polygon breaks. The lines do not close. The shape of the parcel becomes mathematically impossible. Brandt leaned forward, her wiry frame tense with professional offense. This polygon closes perfectly. The acreage is identical. The geometry is intact. The entire shape has simply been picked up and relocated on the grid. That requires recalculating every single point along the perimeter to maintain the internal angles. Dorothea watched the pencil tap against the paper. I need you to say that in writing. Brandt stopped tapping. She looked at Dorothea for a long moment, assessing the junior clerk sitting across from her. Let us be very clear about something, Miss Oakes. I filed an internal discrepancy notice 3 days ago. I did not file it to launch a crusade, and I did not file it to help you. I understand, Dorothea said. Her voice remained steady, her posture unchanged. "Do you?" Brandt asked sharply. "Because you are sitting in my office before hours asking for ammunition against your own department head. I filed that notice because an unanswered internal query is a massive liability for the county survey office. If the city pushes this rezoning through, and 5 years from now Caldwell Industrial starts pouring concrete over a residential property line, the resulting lawsuit will look for a failure in the baseline validation. If the city claims the county signed off on these coordinates, my office is exposed. I am protecting my office. I am protecting my map. I am not protecting you." Dorothea accepted this without a flicker of visible emotion. The motivations of the people around her were secondary to the mechanics of what they could provide. "What matters is that the notice exists," Dorothea said, "and that the discrepancy is documented." Brandt gave a short, hard nod. "It is documented." Dorothea leaned slightly forward, keeping her voice entirely level. "Could a licensed surveyor have made this coordinate offset by mistake? A miscalibration of equipment? A different grid adjustment?" "No," Brandt said immediately. "The offset does not correspond to any standard datum conversion used in Jefferson County practice. It does not match any known historical grid shift. There is no mathematical formula that accidentally produces this specific translation." Brandt picked up the city amendment and dropped it back onto the table with a sharp slap. Someone sat down at a desk, looked at the original numbers, and wrote different numbers. It was a deliberate act of fiction. Dorothea sat in silence for a moment. The confirmation was absolute. The discrepancy she had found with her small plastic ruler was not a bureaucratic phantom. It was a calculated falsification, confirmed by the highest technical authority in the county. "Then I need you to sign a written statement to that effect," Dorothea said, stating that the offset cannot be attributed to standard conversion or drafting error. Brandt studied her. The county surveyor understood exactly what she was being asked to do. She was being asked to put her professional seal on a document that would accuse a senior city attorney of fraud. But Brandt's loyalty was to the grid, to the absolute truth of the coordinates, and the falsification offended her on a fundamental level. "I will draft the statement," Brandt said, turning toward her typewriter. "Wait here." When Dorothea returned to Birmingham City Hall just before 9 o'clock, the air in the main clerk's room was already thick with the humidity of the morning and the low, steady hum of typewriters. She walked to her new desk, the archive maintenance desk, situated in the far back corner near the supply closets. It was a demotion in all but title, a deliberate isolation designed to keep her away from the active filing queue. She sat down, aligned her pens parallel to the edge of the desk, and began sorting a stack of requisition forms. A few minutes later, a colleague from the intake window, a woman named Beatrice who usually avoided the back corner, paused by Dorothea's desk under the pretense of dropping off a misfiled folder. Beatrice did not look directly at Dorothea. She kept her eyes on the folder as she set it down. "The personnel office sent a runner-up this morning," Beatrice murmured, her voice barely carrying over the clatter of the room. "The review meeting. It has been scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. Dorothea did not stop sorting her forms. "Thank you, Beatrice." Beatrice hesitated, then hurried away, eager to distance herself from the contagion of a doomed employee. Dorothea updated the private count in her head. The city council session, where the rezoning amendment would be formally ratified, was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock the following morning. Her personnel review, the meeting where Conrad Hasley would present the fabricated charges of unauthorized access and terminate her employment, was scheduled for 2 o'clock the same day. She now had a hard deadline. Hasley had arranged the timing perfectly. He intended to let the council vote pass at 10, securing the Caldwell Industrial contract, and then eliminate her at 2. If she attempted to raise an alarm before the vote, he would use the pending 2 o'clock disciplinary hearing to discredit her entirely, framing her as a disgruntled, soon-to-be-fired clerk making wild accusations to save her job. The machinery was closing in. At midday, when the office emptied for the lunch hour, Dorothea picked up a stack of archival repair slips. She now had a legitimate work order for her new assignment in archive maintenance. She walked down the long, linoleum-tiled hallway to the archive room. She unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The smell of the archive room in summer hit her immediately, a warm, slightly acidic odor emanating from thousands of craft paper folders and the drying ink of rubber stamps. The room had a single, tall, south-facing window with no shade, and the midday Alabama sun baked the dust motes suspended in the air. It was a room where history was filed away and left to slowly oxidize. Dorothea walked down the narrow aisles between the towering metal shelving units. She did not need to search. She knew exactly where the Caldwell industrial file was located. She pulled the heavy, legal-sized folder from its slot and carried it to the small reading table beneath the window. She opened the cover. She did not take out her camera. She photographed nothing. She simply looked at the intake stamp on the bottom right corner of the original survey cover sheet. The stamp was a standard blue ink grid. It contained the date of receipt, the time, and a blank line for the intake clerk's initials. Dorothea stared at the initials written in faded black ink. W.P. Wallace Pruitt. She closed her eyes and let her photographic memory reconstruct the sequence of events, aligning the dates like physical objects in her mind. 6 weeks ago, the original survey arrived from the county. Wallace Pruitt processed the intake. He stamped it, initialed it, and filed it. He saw the map. He saw the coordinates. 3 weeks ago, Conrad Hasley drafted the falsified amendment and submitted it directly into the queue. 2 weeks ago, the amendment reached the front of the queue. Dorothea had checked the intake stamp on the amendment itself before Hasley reassigned it away from her. The initials on the amendment's intake stamp belonged to a different junior clerk. But Wallace Pruitt was the supervisor on duty that day. Standard zoning office procedure dictated that any amendment altering a boundary line had to be reviewed against the original survey by the supervising clerk before it could be passed through to the pre-council review stage. Pruitt had to have pulled this exact folder. He had to have laid the amendment next to the original survey. He had to have looked at the numbers. Dorothea opened her eyes. The acidic smell of the paper seemed to sharpen in her nostrils. Pruitt had seen the discrepancy. A man who had worked in the zoning office for 19 years, a man whose entire professional existence was defined by his meticulous adherence to procedure, could not have missed a 400-yard shift in a property line. He had seen it, and he had passed it through without noting the discrepancy. Dorothea closed the folder, ensuring the edges of the paper were perfectly flush, and slid it back into its exact place on the shelf. She walked out of the archive room, locking the door behind her. She returned to the main clerk's room. The lunch hour was ending, and the staff was filtering back to their desks. Wallace Pruitt was already at his station, a pipe resting unlit in an ashtray beside his neatly stacked trays. He smelled faintly of sweet tobacco and old wool. Dorothea did not go to her desk. She walked directly across the room and stood in front of Pruitt. Pruitt looked up, his pale eyes blinking behind his thick-lensed glasses. "Miss Oakes, you should be at your station." "I have a question regarding the Caldwell Industrial Amendment, Mr. Pruitt," Dorothea said. Her voice was low, pitched so that only he could hear it, but it carried no hesitation. Pruitt's posture stiffened. "That file has been reassigned. It is no longer your concern." "I am aware," Dorothea said, "but I was reviewing the procedural timeline. The amendment was filed 2 weeks ago. You were the supervising clerk on duty when it was processed." Pruitt did not speak. His right hand, which had been resting on the desk, moved slowly, deliberately, to cover the barrel of his fountain pen. It was a small, defensive gesture, a man shielding his tools. Standard procedure requires the supervising clerk to review any boundary amendment against the original survey on file, Dorothea continued, her tone remaining entirely factual, devoid of accusation. "I am simply asking whether you noted any difference between the amendment coordinates and the original survey coordinates during your review." Pruitt's face did not change. the muscles in his jaw locked. He looked at the paperwork in front of him, refusing to meet her eyes. The amendment was filed as submitted by the lead attorney, Pruitt said, his voice tight and reedy. The intake process was handled according to departmental guidelines. The contents of the file are not your concern, Miss Oakes. I suggest you return to your desk and focus on your current assignment. Dorothea looked at his hand covering the pen. She looked at the rigid set of his shoulders. She did not press him further. She simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt," and walked away. As she crossed the room, the architecture of the conspiracy fully revealed itself to her. The personnel review, the demotion to archive maintenance, the reassignment of the file. It was not just Conrad Hasley covering his tracks. It was also Wallace Pruitt protecting himself. Pruitt had discovered Hasley's falsification 2 weeks ago. Instead of blowing the whistle and risking the wrath of a senior city attorney, Pruitt had chosen cowardice. He had stamped the file and looked the other way, making himself complicit. Now Dorothea's discovery threatened to expose not only Hasley's fraud, but Pruitt's negligence. The two men had separate motivations, but their goal was identical. Dorothea Oakes had to be silenced. She had to account for both of them. At 2 o'clock, Dorothea requested a 15-minute break. She left the building and walked 2 blocks down the street, away from the immediate vicinity of City Hall, until she found a public payphone mounted on the brick wall of a pharmacy. The afternoon heat was oppressive, radiating upward from the concrete sidewalk. Dorothea opened her purse, took out her small change purse, and extracted a dime. She fed the coin into the slot. Clink. The coin dropped, but the line remained dead. She pressed the coin return, retrieved the dime, and tried a second one. Clink. The hollow ring of the dial tone hummed in her ear. She dialed the number for Greater Shiloh Baptist Church. Reverend Matthias Cobb answered on the third ring. Cobb. His deliberate baritone was a grounding force over the crackling line. "It is Dorothea Oakes," she said, keeping her voice low, watching the street traffic roll past. "The council member angle is a dead end." There was a pause on the line. "Are you certain?" Cobb asked. "I pulled the public meeting minutes for the zoning subcommittee," Dorothea explained. "The amendment was submitted into the filing queue 3 weeks ago. The council member's private meeting with the Caldwell Industrial Project Manager occurred only 10 days ago. The timeline does not align. The falsification predates their contact. The council member may be voting for it, but they did not originate the change." Cobb was silent for a long moment. She could hear the faint sound of his breathing, the heavy contemplation of a man who was used to adjusting his understanding of the world. "The attorney I contacted confirmed the same thing this morning," Cobb finally said. He pulled the council member's financial disclosures. "There is nothing there. We were chasing a ghost." "The change originated inside the zoning office," Dorothea said, "with the lead attorney, Conrad Hasley." "Can you prove that?" "I have a signed statement from the county survey office confirming the coordinates were deliberately altered," Dorothea said. "And I have the photostat copy of the original survey." "The attorney wants to see the copy," Cobb said, his voice tightening with sudden urgency. "He says if we are going to move, we have to move now. Can you bring it to the church tonight?" "Yes," Dorothea said. "I will be there at 7. She hung up the phone. The false lead had collapsed, but the true path was now clear, and it was far more dangerous. When Dorothea returned to her desk in the archive maintenance corner, the afternoon stretched out in a tense, suffocating silence. At 3:30, she heard the distinct, measured footsteps before she saw him. Conrad Hasley appeared in the aisle between the desks. He was wearing a crisp seersucker suit that seemed entirely immune to the summer heat. He moved with a relaxed, effortless grace, a man completely at ease in his domain. He stopped in front of Dorothea's desk. Dorothea was typing a repair log. She did not stop typing. She did not look up. "Miss Oakes," Hasley said. His voice was smooth, quiet, and perfectly modulated. It was the voice of a man who never needed to shout to be obeyed. Dorothea finished the line, hit the carriage return, and looked up. Mr. Hasley. Hasley glanced around the cramped, poorly lit corner of the room. I trust the transition to archive maintenance has been smooth. It has been adequately documented, Dorothea said. Hasley smiled. It was a polite, professional expression that contained absolutely no warmth. He rested his fingertips lightly on the edge of her desk. I understand there is a personnel matter pending, scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. That is my understanding as well, Dorothea said. It is always unfortunate when these administrative issues arise, Hasley said, his tone conversational, almost sympathetic. They can be disruptive to the workflow. They can be damaging to a young clerk's future prospects. I hope the matter will be resolved quickly. I have no interest in prolonging it. He let the silence hang between them. The subtext was unmistakable, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on the desk. Return the copy, keep your mouth shut, let the vote pass, and you might survive this. Thank you, Mr. Hasley, Dorothea said, her voice betraying nothing. I appreciate your concern for the workflow. Hasley looked at her for a second longer, his eyes searching her face for any sign of capitulation. He found none. He tapped his fingers once on the desk, turned, and walked away. That evening, the air in Reverend Cobb's church office was thick and still. The small desk lamp cast a pool of yellow light across the scarred wooden surface of the desk. Dorothea sat in the chair opposite the desk. Reverend Cobb sat behind it, his large frame filling the space, his legal pad open in front of him. Standing beside the desk was the civil rights attorney Cobb had retained. He was a tall, sharply dressed black man with an intense, analytical gaze. He had spent the last decade fighting the city of Birmingham over voting districts and municipal employment records. He knew the architecture of City Hall's deceptions better than anyone. Dorothea opened her purse. She bypassed the crossword puzzle booklet where she kept her handwritten transcription. Instead, she reached into the side pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. She handed it to the attorney. The attorney opened the envelope and slid the 2 photostat pages onto the desk, directly under the lamp. The pages were stark in the yellow light. The quality of the photostat reproduction was uneven. The background was slightly gray where the original ink had been thin, but the boundary numbers at the center of the specification page were dark, heavy, and undeniably clear. The edges of each page were faintly smudged from where Dorothea had handled them in the dark of the archive room hallway. The attorney leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning the coordinates. He compared them to a copy of the city amendment he had brought with him. 420 yards, the attorney murmured, right into the edge of Collegeville. He looked up at Dorothea. Describe exactly how you obtained these pages. Dorothea sat perfectly straight. I used the office photostat machine down the hall from the archive room. It was after hours. I entered the archive room, retrieved the original survey file, carried it to the machine, copied the cover sheet and the boundary specification page, and returned the file to its exact location. Did anyone see you? No, but the machine has a usage log. I had to sign it to activate the exposure lamp. Mr. Hasley is aware that a copy was made, and he is aware that I made it. The attorney nodded slowly. Hasley will argue that you stole city property. He will try to frame this as an act of corporate espionage or unauthorized removal of sensitive documents. Can he? Cobb asked, his deep voice rumbling in the small room. He can try, the attorney said, straightening up, but he will fail. Under Alabama public records practice, a finalized land survey submitted to a municipal zoning office is a matter of public record. It is not classified. It is not privileged attorney-client work product. Miss Oakes is a city employee who made a copy of a public document using city equipment. Her possession of this copy is entirely legal. The only thing illegal here is the alteration of the amendment. The attorney picked up the signed statement from Sylvia Brandt that Dorothea had provided earlier. He read it through again, his eyes tracking the county surveyor's blunt, technical condemnation of the coordinates. This is the linchpin, the attorney said, tapping Brandt's statement. The photostat proves what the original numbers were. This statement proves that the change was a deliberate falsification, not a clerical error. Together, they form a complete chain of evidence. He turned to his briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal-sized paper. He uncapped his pen. I'm going to draft a formal public objection to the rezoning application. We will attach the photostat copy and the county surveyor's statement as exhibits. While the attorney began to write, the narrative shifted across the city to a quiet, affluent neighborhood in Mountain Brook. Conrad Hasley sat in his study, the door closed against the sounds of his house. He held the telephone receiver to his ear. The meeting is confirmed for 2 o'clock tomorrow, the voice on the other end said. It was Hasley's contact at the city personnel office. We have the room reserved. Excellent, Hasley said. He held his pen in his free hand, his thumb resting on the cap. There is one procedural issue, Conrad, the contact said, sounding slightly nervous. If Miss Oakes does not appear for the review, if she abandons her position, we can process the termination in absentia. But a same-day processing requires the signature of the department head. Human Resources will not finalize the paperwork without it. Hasley clicked the pen cap. Click. Do not worry about the department head, Hasley said smoothly. I will handle him personally in the morning. Just ensure the paperwork is drafted and ready for signature by noon. I want her access to the building revoked the moment the meeting concludes. Understood. Hasley hung up the phone. He looked at his watch. In 14 hours, the city council would call the session to order. The rezoning would pass. The Caldwell industrial contract would be secured, and Dorothea Oakes would be erased from the bureaucratic record. Back in the church office, the attorney finished the final paragraph of the objection and signed his name with a sharp, decisive flourish. He looked up at Dorothea and Reverend Cobb. Here is the reality of the situation, the attorney said, his voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. This objection is a procedural bomb, but it only detonates if it is filed at the exact right moment. The city council session begins at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The rezoning amendment is third on the agenda. He looked directly at Dorothea. Your personnel review is at 2 o'clock. Hasley has structured this perfectly. He knows that if he can delay us, or if he can discredit you before 10 o'clock, the council will vote. Once the vote is ratified, unraveling it will take years of litigation, and Caldwell Industrial will already be breaking ground in Collegeville. Reverend Cobb leaned forward, his large hands resting flat on his legal pad. So we file it before the vote. We file it with the city clerk's office before the gavel falls, the attorney confirmed. It must be entered into the official record before the session is called to order. If it is in the record, the council chair is legally obligated to acknowledge it before calling for a vote. The attorney gathered the papers and placed them carefully into a manila folder. He looked at Dorothea. Hasley is going to spend tomorrow morning looking for you. He will use every piece of leverage he has to stop this from reaching the chamber. You need to go to work tomorrow exactly as scheduled. Sit at your desk, do your job. Be visible. Let him think his trap is closing. If you disappear, he will panic and move the vote up. Dorothea nodded. She understood the assignment. She was to be the bait, holding Hasley's attention while the attorney moved the documents into place. 10 o'clock, Dorothea said softly. 10 o'clock, the attorney agreed. Dorothea stood up. She picked up her purse, feeling the weight of the crossword booklet inside, the handwritten numbers still pressing against the paper. She walked out of the church office and into the warm, heavy night of Birmingham. The machinery was fully exposed now, all the gears and levers visible. Tomorrow they would see whose hands were stronger. Dorothea Oakes stood inside her apartment door without turning on the light. The heavy, humid air of the Birmingham night pressed against the single window of her front room, but inside, the atmosphere was entirely still. She did not move from the threshold. Her hand remained on the brass doorknob, her fingers curled around the metal as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. She surveyed what she could see from the doorway. The ambient light from the street lamp outside cast a pale, elongated geometric shape across the worn linoleum floor, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the dead air. Nothing was visibly moved. The small armchair sat at its precise angle against the wall. The stack of magazines on the side table remained squared off, exactly as she had left them. The throw rug was flat. Yet, the space felt fundamentally altered, carrying the invisible weight of a recent, unauthorized presence. She released the doorknob. Her footsteps were soundless as she walked across the front room and into the narrow kitchen. She did not reach for the pull chain of the overhead bulb. She moved by memory, navigating the tight clearance between the counter and the small wooden table where she ate her meals. She knelt on the linoleum. Reaching a hand upward, she slid her fingers under the table drawer. She felt the rough, unfinished grain of the wood, her fingertips seeking the familiar, crisp edge of the sealed envelope she had taped there 2 nights prior. The wood was bare. Dorothea stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. She moved her hand further back, sweeping the entire underside of the drawer. The envelope was gone. She pressed her index fingertip against the exact spot where the tape strip used to be. The smooth underside of the drawer yielded a distinct, tactile resistance. The adhesive residue from the tape was still slightly tacky against her skin. She withdrew her hand and stood up in the dark kitchen. She remained standing there for a full minute, listening to the distant, muffled sound of a truck shifting gears on the avenue 2 blocks away. The violation of her home was absolute, executed with a quiet, bureaucratic efficiency that mirrored the falsification of the zoning documents themselves. They had not ransacked the apartment. They had known exactly what they were looking for, and they had taken only that. She felt the familiar, heavy weight of her leather purse hanging from her shoulder. She unclasped it and reached inside, her fingers brushing past her wallet to find the small, wire-bound crossword puzzle booklet. She did not need to open it to know the handwritten transcription was still there, folded neatly between the pages. She never left the booklet at home. The numbers, the true coordinates of the Roebuck Park corridor, were safe, pressed against the cheap newsprint of the puzzle book. But the photostat copy, the physical proof of the original survey cover sheet and the boundary specification page, was in Conrad Hasley's possession. Or it was already ash. Dorothea turned and walked back through the dark apartment. She stepped out into the hallway, pulling her door shut behind her and testing the lock twice. The corridor of her building was bathed in the sickly yellow light of a low-wattage bulb. The air smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and floor wax. She walked to the end of the hall where the communal pay telephone hung on the plaster wall. She retrieved a coin from her purse, dropped it into the metallic slot, and dialed the number for Reverend Matthias Cobb. The rotary mechanism whirs back into place with heavy, deliberate clicks, a mechanical countdown in the silent hallway. Cobb answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, thick with sleep, but instantly alert. "Yes." "It is Dorothea," she said, her voice pitched low, barely carrying beyond the mouthpiece. "The copy has been taken from my apartment. The envelope is gone." She heard the heavy intake of breath on the other end of the line. She did not elaborate on the intrusion. She did not describe the tacky adhesive or the dark kitchen. She only reported the logistical failure. The evidence was compromised. "When?" Cobb asked. "Sometime between my leaving for work this morning and returning just now," Dorothea replied. "They knew I would be at the office. They knew I would be at the church." There was a long pause on the line. The faint static of the telephone connection hissed in Dorothea's ear. She braced herself for the collapse of their strategy. Without the photostat copy, Sylvia Brandt's discrepancy notice was merely an internal county query pointing at a clerical error. It was not proof of a cover-up. "Miss Oakes," Cobb said, his voice steady, anchoring the conversation. "Listen to me carefully. The attorney we met with yesterday is a very careful man. He has dealt with the city of Birmingham for a long time. He knows how these people operate." Dorothea gripped the black plastic receiver tighter. "What are you saying?" I am saying that the attorney made his own copy of your 2 pages the previous evening before you left his office, Cobb told her. He ran them through his own machine. The pages they stole from your apartment were your copies. The originals, the actual survey file, are still sitting in the city archive room, and the attorney's copy is sitting in a locked briefcase in his study. The evidence is intact. Dorothea closed her eyes. She exhaled, a long, slow release of breath that fogged the black plastic of the receiver. The machinery was still moving. Hasley had executed a flawless retrieval operation, but he had moved 24 hours too late. "Are you safe in that building?" Cobb asked, the pastoral concern bleeding through the tactical discussion. "They only wanted the paper," Dorothea said. "They have it. They will not come back." "Tomorrow is the vote," Cobb reminded her. 10 o'clock. "I know," Dorothea said. "I will be at my desk." She hung up the telephone. The coin dropped into the internal vault with a final metallic clink. She walked back to her apartment, locked the door, and sat in the armchair in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise over the industrial smog of the city. Morning arrived with a suffocating humidity that promised a brutal afternoon. Dorothea went to work exactly as scheduled. She rode the city bus downtown, watching the storefronts and the pedestrian traffic with a detached, clinical observation. She arrived at Birmingham City Hall at 10 minutes to 8, walking through the heavy brass doors and crossing the marble lobby to the Planning and Zoning Department. She took her seat at the archive maintenance desk, the station to which Wallace Pruitt had demoted her. Not appearing today would be a fatal error. It would accelerate the personnel process, giving Hasley the unexcused absence he needed to justify an immediate termination before the council session began. She had to remain a visible, functioning cog in the municipal machine. She began her assigned task. The work consisted of sorting misfiled intake forms, checking the serial numbers against the master ledger, and preparing them for refiling in the basement storage. She worked with her usual mechanical precision. She withdrew the small wooden ruler from her desk drawer and used it to align the edges of the carbon copies, ensuring the stacks were perfectly flush. She did not deviate from her routine. She did not look toward the main clerk's room. The atmosphere in the office was distinctly altered. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, mimeograph ink, and unspoken tension. Several colleagues avoided her eye. A typist, 2 desks over, picked up a stack of manila folders and walked the long way around the perimeter of the room to reach the filing cabinets, deliberately avoiding the aisle that passed Dorothea's station. The office had heard something. The bureaucratic grapevine of City Hall was highly efficient, and the word had circulated that Dorothea Oakes was the subject of a severe personnel review initiated by the senior legal counsel. In the rigid hierarchy of 1971 Birmingham, a black female clerk drawing the ire of a white senior attorney was a contagion to be avoided at all costs. The silence around her was a physical pressure, but she used it to focus her mind, counting the minutes as the wall clock ticked toward 9. Conrad Hasley arrived at the office at precisely 9 o'clock. He walked through the double glass doors of the department with his usual measured, unhurried stride. He wore a pale blue seersucker suit, completely unwrinkled despite the morning heat, his tie perfectly knotted. He carried a slim leather briefcase. He did not look toward the archive maintenance desk. Hasley stopped at Wallace Pruitt's desk at the front of the clerk's room. Dorothea watched them from the periphery of her vision, her hands continuing to sort the intake forms without pausing. Hasley leaned down slightly, resting one hand on the edge of Pruitt's desk. They spoke in low voices for under a minute. The specific words were indistinguishable over the clatter of the typewriters and the ringing of the routing telephones, but the posture of the 2 men communicated everything. Pruitt sat rigidly in his chair, his hands folded over a stack of pending applications. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. The faint, sweet smell of Pruitt's pipe tobacco drifted across the room, mingling with the sharp scent of the mimeograph fluid. Hasley straightened up. He adjusted his cuffs, turned, and walked to his own office at the rear of the department. He did not cast a single glance across the room at Dorothea. He closed his solid oak door behind him with a firm, definitive click. He believed the threat was neutralized. He believed the photostat copy was sitting in the breast pocket of his suit, recovered from the kitchen of a junior clerk who had overstepped her bounds and was now awaiting her inevitable termination at 2 o'clock. Dorothea picked up her ruler, aligned the next stack of papers, and continued filing. At 9:40, the civil rights attorney and Reverend Matthias Cobb arrived at the heavy bronze doors of Birmingham City Hall. They did not enter the planning and zoning department on the 3rd floor. They proceeded directly to the city clerk's office on the 2nd floor, the central nervous system of municipal record-keeping. The city clerk's office was a cavernous room of polished oak counters and frosted glass partitions, echoing with the relentless sound of rubber stamps and the low hum of administrative conversation. The attorney, carrying a pristine manila envelope, approached the main intake window. Cobb stood half a step behind him, his large frame casting a long shadow across the marble floor, his face an impassive mask of dignified resolve. The attorney slid the documents beneath the brass grille of the intake window. The submission was meticulously assembled. On top was a formal cover letter citing the municipal code regarding public objections to zoning amendments. Beneath it was Sylvia Brandt's signed discrepancy statement, clearly detailing the cartographic impossibility of the coordinate shift. Attached to that was the attorney's crisp copy of the 2 photostat pages Dorothea had pulled from the machine days earlier. Finally, there was a written summary outlining the exact nature of the falsification and requesting an immediate halt to the ratification process. The intake clerk, a young woman with heavily sprayed hair, pulled the documents through the slot. She scanned the cover letter, her eyes widening slightly as she registered the names and the subject matter. She looked up at the attorney, then at Cobb, before looking back down at the paper. She had no authority to reject a properly formatted public filing. She reached for the heavy, mechanical date stamp machine sitting on her ink blotter. She adjusted the metal dials to ensure the time was accurate, positioned the machine over the top right corner of the cover letter, and brought the handle down with a loud, percussive crack. The city clerk's office stamped the objection received at 9:52. The document was now a matter of public record. It existed in the legal reality of the city. The attorney requested a stamped receipt, which the clerk provided with trembling fingers. Cobb checked his pocket watch, snapped it shut, and nodded to the attorney. They turned and walked out of the office, heading toward the grand staircase that led to the council chambers. At 10 o'clock, the gavel fell in the main chamber. The city council session was called to order. The objection reached the council chamber at 10:06. It was exactly 6 minutes into the session, during the preliminary reading of the minutes, well before the East Corridor rezoning item was reached on the day's agenda. The council chamber was a vast, imposing room designed to project authority. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the air was thick with the squeak of wooden chairs on the hard floor as the gallery attendees shifted their weight. The council chair, a formidable man with a shock of white hair and a booming, theatrical voice, sat at the center of the elevated dais. A junior clerk from the 2nd floor hurried down the side aisle, bypassed the public seating, and handed the freshly stamped folder directly to the council chair's parliamentarian, who immediately slid it onto the chair's blotter. The chair paused mid-sentence. He frowned, adjusting his reading glasses as he opened the folder. He read the cover letter in silence. The chamber grew quiet, the low murmur of background conversation dying away as the politicians and the public sensed a procedural rhythm. Conrad Hasley was present in the chamber. He sat at the legal counsel's table situated just below the dais, positioned to advise the council on the rezoning application when it came up for a vote. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his own leather portfolio. He watched the council chair read the document. The chair cleared his throat and leaned toward his microphone. The chair recognizes a formal public objection filed this morning with the city clerk's office regarding agenda item number 3, the Caldwell Industrial Corridor rezoning amendment. Hasley's eyes locked onto the chair. His posture did not change, but the relaxed ease vanished from his shoulders. The chair continued, reading the cover letter aloud into the public record. His voice echoed off the wood paneling. The objection cites a severe coordinate discrepancy between the filed amendment and the Jefferson County Survey baseline. It includes a signed statement from the County Survey Office, as well as duplicated records of the original municipal survey, indicating that the boundary coordinates were altered after the initial filing. Hasley reached slowly into the breast pocket of his seersucker suit. He withdrew his silver pen. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. He pressed his thumb against the top. Click. The sharp, metallic sound was barely audible over the chair's booming voice, but Hasley felt the vibration in his hand. He pressed it again. Click. He stopped. He did not click it a third time. The realization washed over him with the cold, crushing weight of deep water. The copy he had retrieved from the apartment was a decoy, or a duplicate. The true evidence had bypassed him entirely. It was in the hands of outside counsel, and it was currently being read into the permanent, unalterable record of the city council. The trap he had built for Dorothea Oakes had closed on empty air, and her trap had just snapped shut around his neck. The council chair finished reading the summary. He looked over his glasses at the assembly, his face a mask of bureaucratic, severe displeasure. Given the nature of this objection, and the inclusion of a sworn statement from a county official regarding the integrity of the baseline data, the chair orders the rezoning vote for the Caldwell Industrial Corridor tabled immediately, pending a full review by the city auditor's office. The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack. The vote would not happen today. Hasley stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with one hand. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice calm, perfectly modulated, carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "If I may address the chamber, as lead counsel for this application, I believe I can clarify this administrative misunderstanding regarding the drafting process." "You may not, Mr. Hasley," the chair interrupted, his tone flat and uncompromising. "The submission is a public record. The allegations involve the alteration of filed documents. The review is now procedural and mandatory. There is nothing to debate until the auditor returns a finding. You may take your seat." Hasley held the chair's gaze for a fraction of a second. He did not argue. He did not show anger. He simply nodded, a tight, controlled motion, and sat back down. He placed his silver pen flat on the table and stared at the wood grain. Down on the third floor, Dorothea was at her archive desk. The morning had stretched into the early afternoon. She was cross-referencing a stack of commercial permits when a colleague from the permitting division passed through the room. The man was carrying a rolled set of blueprints and stopped by the water cooler near the center of the clerk's room. "Did you hear?" the man said to a typist who was changing her ribbon. "Council meeting got held up. They tabled the East Corridor rezoning." The typist looked up, her hands stained with black ink. "Tabled it? I thought Caldwell had the votes locked up." "They did," the man said, taking a paper cup from the dispenser. "Somebody filed an objection right before the gavel, something about a discrepancy notice from the county survey office." The chair kicked the whole file over to the city auditor. Hasley looked like he swallowed a lemon. The colleague drank his water, crushed the cup, and tossed it into the bin. He did not look toward the archive maintenance desk. He did not connect this massive procedural derailment to the quiet, precise black woman sitting in the corner with her wooden ruler. To him, she was merely part of the office furniture. Dorothea heard every word. She did not stop working. She aligned a carbon copy with her ruler, her hands perfectly steady. She drew a straight line in pencil across the ledger. The first phase was complete. The vote was stopped. But she knew Conrad Hasley, and she knew the danger was not over. The personnel review was still scheduled for 2 o'clock. Hasley left the council chamber at 1:15. He walked down the marble staircase from the second floor to the third. He did not go to his own office first. He walked with a measured, unhurried stride, his leather briefcase swinging slightly at his side. his face a mask of absolute calm. But his trajectory was direct and unbroken. He bypassed the main intake window, walked through the double glass doors of the planning department, and strode straight across the main clerk's room. The clatter of typewriters faltered and died away as he moved. He walked to the archive maintenance desk and stood directly in front of it. The shadow of his frame fell across Dorothea's paperwork. She finished writing a serial number, capped her pen, and looked up. The smell of his cologne, a dry cedar and soap scent, preceded him, cutting through the stale, dusty air of the archive corner. It was a clean, expensive smell, entirely out of place among the rotting cardboard and old paper. Hasley looked down at her. He did not raise his voice. When he spoke, his tone was conversational, almost instructional, the voice of a senior partner explaining a basic concept to a slow law student. "The copy you made," Hasley said quietly, "was a city document. It was generated on city equipment, using city materials, depicting city property." Dorothea sat perfectly still. She kept her hands folded on her desk, resting on top of her ruler. "Its removal from city premises," Hasley continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "and its submission through outside counsel constitutes a gross misuse of city property and a violation of your employment terms. You stole from this office, Miss Oakes. The personnel review at 2 o'clock will reflect this. You will be terminated for cause, and you will forfeit your pension contributions." He delivered the threat without malice, presenting it as a simple, unavoidable mathematical equation: action and consequence. Dorothea looked at the knot of his tie, perfectly symmetrical against his collar, and then raised her eyes to meet his. She did not blink. "The photostat machine log," Dorothea said, her voice just as quiet, just as controlled, "shows that I copied the document 3 days before your personnel notice was filed." Hasley's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. "That means," Dorothea continued, "the copy was made before any formal dispute existed regarding my access to the archive. Furthermore, a public document, legally copied from city records by a city employee during the course of her duties, is not city property in the sense you are describing." She watched his face. She knew she was right. She had spent the previous evening in the public library before meeting Cobb, reading the relevant municipal ordinance. She remembered the exact texture of the photostated municipal code page she had studied. The paper had been slightly rough, the ink faded at the top margin where the machine's exposure had been too high. She had underlined the specific provision in soft pencil. Under Section 4A of the Municipal Records Act, Dorothea recited from memory, her voice steady and clear: "A duplicate of a public filing, once generated, is considered informational material, not proprietary city property, provided it does not contain classified personnel or security data. A zoning survey is a public record. My possession of it was legal. My transmission of it to a citizen requesting public records was legal." She did not look away from him. She held his gaze, letting him see the absolute certainty in her eyes. She was not a frightened clerk caught in a lie. She was a technician who had read the manual, and she was explaining the rules to a man who thought he was above them. Hasley stared at her. For a long, suspended moment, the absolute stillness of his demeanor threatened to crack. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He absorbed the information, processing the legal reality of her defense. He realized she had memorized the timeline. She had memorized the law. She had anticipated his exact angle of attack and had built a reinforced wall to meet it. He had nothing left to threaten her with. Hasley turned on his heel and walked away. He did not say another word. He walked across the silent clerk's room and entered his office, shutting the door. The dry, cedar and soap scent lingered at Dorothea's desk for several minutes, a ghost of his failed intimidation. Across the room, Wallace Pruitt had heard the entire exchange. His desk was close enough to catch the quiet, intense dialogue. Pruitt did not look up from his work. His hands remained flat on his green ink blotter. He stared at a blank intake form, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The room remained dead quiet until a typist in the back corner tentatively struck a key, and the mechanical rhythm of the office slowly resumed. At 2 o'clock, Dorothea walked into the small, windowless conference room used for personnel reviews. The room smelled of floor wax and old cigarette smoke. She took a seat at the scarred wooden table. Conrad Hazley sat across from her. Next to him sat the department head, a tired-looking man in his late 50s who clearly wished to be anywhere else. The department head had a manila folder open in front of him. He looked at Dorothea, then down at the paper. "Miss Oakes," the department head began, his voice lacking conviction. "We are here to review a formal recommendation for your termination, submitted by Mr. Hazley. The charge is unauthorized access to the restricted archive room, specifically the original survey files, and conduct unbecoming a city employee." He read the charge aloud, outlining the dates of her alleged infractions. Dorothea waited patiently for him to finish. When he closed his mouth, she opened her own folder. "Regarding my most recent visit to the archive room," Dorothea said, her voice calm and professional, "I was acting under a direct work order." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is the routing slip assigning me to archive maintenance, signed by Mr. Pruitt. My presence in the room was required to fulfill my assigned duties." The department head looked at the slip. He nodded slowly. "And the prior visit? The one that prompted this review?" Dorothea reached into her folder again. She withdrew a single sheet of paper and placed it squarely in the center of the table. It was the signed archive access form, the exact form Wallace Pruitt had placed in front of her days earlier, demanding her signature to create a written record of her after-hours visit. "My prior visit was during authorized office hours," Dorothea stated. "And as you can see, the visit was formally logged and signed off by my direct supervisor." The department head leaned forward. He looked at the form. He saw Dorothea's signature at the bottom, and right next to it, on the supervisor's approval line, he saw the unmistakable, cramped signature of Wallace Pruitt. Pruitt had forced her to sign it to protect himself, but in doing so, he had officially sanctioned the visit in the department's own records. The department head looked at the signature for a long time. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at Conrad Hazley. Hazley's expression did not change. His face remained a mask of polite indifference, but his eyes were cold. He looked at the form, recognizing Pruitt's signature, recognizing the bureaucratic shield Dorothea had just raised. He had built his termination case on the premise of unauthorized access. The department's own paperwork proved the access was authorized. "Mr. Hazley?" the department head asked quietly. Hazley looked at Dorothea. He did not click his pen. He placed his hands flat on the table. "It appears," Hazley said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of defeat, "that the matter may require further review regarding supervisory protocols. The documentation is contradictory." The department head sighed, a sound of profound relief. He did not want to fire a clerk over a paperwork dispute, especially not on a day when the city council had just launched an auditor's investigation into the department. He closed the manila folder and tapped it once against the table. "Very well," the department head said. "I am tabling the termination recommendation pending HR clarification on supervisory sign-offs. Miss Oakes, you may return to your desk. Mr. Hazley, I will need to speak with you regarding the auditor's request that just came down from the council." Dorothea stood up. She picked up her folder, pushed her chair in, and walked out of the room. The trap had sprung open, and it was entirely empty. Late that night, the heat of the day finally broke, giving way to a heavy, rolling thunderstorm that washed the streets of Birmingham. Dorothea was in her apartment. The front room light was off. She sat in the armchair, listening to the rain lash against the single window. The hall telephone rang. Dorothea stood up, walked out into the dim hallway, and picked up the receiver. "Yes," she said. "It is done," Reverend Matthias Cobb said. His voice was heavy with exhaustion, but laced with a profound, quiet victory that resonated through the static of the line. "Tell me," Dorothea said. The city auditor's office moved faster than anyone expected, Cobb told her. The council chair must have put the fear of God into them. They formally requested the original survey and the filed amendment for a comparison review this evening. Dorothea leaned her forehead against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. Did they get them? They did, Cobb confirmed. The auditor's deputies went down to the planning department at 6 o'clock. They pulled both files directly from the archive room. They signed the chain of custody logs. The documents are now locked in the auditor's vault on the 4th floor. Dorothea closed her eyes. The tension that had been coiled in her spine for the past week finally began to unspool. They are out of the department, Cobb said, his voice softening. They are no longer under Hasley's reach. He cannot alter them. He cannot destroy them. The auditor has the original survey, and they have the falsified amendment. All they have to do is look at the numbers. The numbers do not lie, Dorothea whispered. No, Cobb agreed. They do not. You did it, Miss Oakes. You stopped the machine. Dorothea held the receiver for a moment longer, listening to the steady breathing of the Reverend on the other end of the line. She thought of the tacky adhesive under her kitchen table. She thought of the cedar and soap cologne fading in the archive room. She thought of the small wooden ruler in her desk drawer, waiting for her in the morning. I will see you tomorrow, Reverend, she said. She hung up the telephone, walked back into her dark apartment, and finally turned on the light. The machinery of the city of Birmingham did not operate on sudden epiphanies or dramatic courtroom confessions. It operated on paper. It operated on the slow, grinding friction of carbon copies, intake stamps, and filing queues. When the machine was forced to correct itself, it did so with the same methodical, bloodless precision that had allowed it to be corrupted in the first place. On the 4th floor of City Hall, inside the climate-controlled vault of the city auditor's office, the correction began before the sun had fully risen over the industrial smog of the Eastern Corridor. 2 senior deputies, men who wore short-sleeved white shirts and dark ties even in the suffocating heat of an Alabama summer, sat at a long steel table. Between them lay the 2 documents that Reverend Matthias Cobb's civil rights attorney had forced into the light. The original county survey, retrieved under a chain of custody mandate from the planning department archive, and the filed rezoning amendment, pulled from the active pre-council queue. The comparison did not take long. The deputies did not need to understand the political ramifications of the Collegeville neighborhood, nor did they need to care about the metal stamping plant Caldwell Industrial intended to build. They only needed to look at the numbers. They aligned the boundary specification pages side by side. They checked the datum conversions. They checked the grid references. They traced the typed coordinates on the amendment and compared them to the inked coordinates on the original survey. The numbers did not match. The offset was directional, consistent, and mathematically deliberate. It was exactly as Sylvia Brandt, the county surveyor, had stated in her discrepancy notice. It was not a rounding error. It was not a drafting mistake. Someone had intentionally rewritten the geography of the city to move a wall of noise, particulate air, and heavy truck traffic away from the white suburb of Roebuck Park and directly against the property lines of the black residents of Collegeville. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the auditor's office had completed its work. A 2-page finding document was produced. It was typed on official city letterhead, the keys striking the ribbon with heavy, definitive snaps. The finding was a masterpiece of bureaucratic neutrality. It did not use the word fraud. It did not use the word falsification. It simply laid out the timeline of the paper trail. It noted the original boundary coordinates. It noted the boundary coordinate difference on the amendment. It noted the amendment submission date. And, crucially, it noted that the amendment had bypassed the standard attorney review step, entering the queue directly. The finding did not name Conrad Hasley on its face. The auditor's office dealt in processes, not personnel. But at the bottom of the second page, listed under the chain of submission, was the submitting attorney's file number. It was a 7-digit alphanumeric code. In the directory of the Birmingham City Attorney General's office, that code corresponded to only one desk. At 9 o'clock, the auditor's finding was placed into 2 heavy manila envelopes. One was hand-delivered by a clerk to the office of the city council chair. The second was carried down to the city attorney general's office. Conrad Hasley was sitting at his desk when the notification arrived. His office was exactly as it always was, immaculate, ordered, and quiet. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp, parallel shadows across his pristine blotter. He was wearing his customary summer seersucker suit, the fabric crisp and unwrinkled. He had a file open in front of him, a pen resting in his right hand. He was a man who had built his entire career, his entire reputation, on finishing every project on time and without visible conflict. He had engineered the Caldwell industrial rezoning with the same frictionless efficiency he applied to everything else. He had counted on the inertia of the clerk's room. He had counted on the absolute certainty that no one would look at the numbers. The telephone on his desk rang. Hasley picked up the receiver. He did not say his name, he merely offered a quiet, professional greeting. The voice on the other end belonged to the chief deputy of the city attorney general. The conversation lasted less than 40 seconds. The deputy informed Hasley that the city auditor had submitted a procedural finding regarding the East Corridor rezoning amendment. The deputy informed Hasley that the finding noted a coordinate discrepancy. The deputy informed Hasley that his file number was listed on the submission record. Hasley's expression did not change. His breathing did not accelerate. He listened to the words, processing the institutional weight behind them. He understood immediately what had happened. The copy Dorothea Oakes had made, the copy he had tried to contain, the copy he had tried to discredit, had found its way into the one piece of machinery he could not control. The auditor's office had pulled the original survey. The paper trail was closed. The containment strategy had failed. "I understand," Hasley said quietly into the receiver. "Thank you for the notification." He hung up the telephone. He sat in the silence of his office for a long moment. He looked at the closed door. He looked at the neat stacks of pending files on his credenza. He raised his right hand, the pen still resting between his fingers. With his thumb, he clicked the pen cap. Once, twice, 3 times. The sharp, metallic clicks were the only sounds in the room. He did not throw the pen. He did not sweep the files off his desk. He was a methodical man, and methodical men do not rage against the turning of the wheel. They simply calculate the new trajectory. He picked up the telephone again and dialed his assistant's extension in the outer office. "Margaret," Hasley said, his voice perfectly level, never rising above its usual measured cadence. "I need you to reschedule my afternoon appointments. All of them. Move them to next week."
Are you feeling unwell, Mr. Hasley?
His assistant asked. "A scheduling conflict has arisen," Hasley replied smoothly. "I will be unavailable for the remainder of the day." He hung up the phone. He called no one else. He did not call his brother-in-law, whose financial stake in Caldwell Industrial was now effectively dead. He did not call his allies on the zoning board. He knew the rules of the ecosystem he inhabited. When the auditor's finding reached the Attorney General, the infection was isolated. Any contact he made now would only spread the liability. He placed his pen perfectly parallel to the edge of his blotter, stood up, smoothed the front of his seersucker jacket, and walked out of his office. Down in the basement of City Hall, the archive room was cool and smelled faintly of aging paper, binding glue, and the metallic tang of the photostat machine down the hall. Dorothea Oakes was sitting at the archive maintenance desk. She had not been reassigned back to the main clerk's room. The department head had not yet formally processed the fallout of the tabled council vote, and so Dorothea remained in her punitive exile, sorting through boxes of closed permits from the 1950s. She was working with her usual precision. Her hair was pinned tightly against her scalp. Her posture was perfectly straight. She was checking a stack of carbon copies against a master ledger, using her small wooden ruler to keep her place on the page. She did not look like a woman who had just derailed a multi-million-dollar industrial contract. She looked exactly like what she was, a junior clerk doing her job. The heavy black telephone on the edge of the archive desk rang. Dorothea placed her ruler down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the ledger, and picked up the receiver.
Archive maintenance, Miss Oakes speaking.
Miss Oakes, the deliberate baritone of Reverend Matthias Cobb, came through the line.
Good morning, Reverend,
Dorothea said. She kept her voice low, though she was alone in the room. The attorney just called me, Cobb said. His voice was heavy, moving with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. The auditor's office delivered their finding to the council chair 10 minutes ago. The attorney has a contact in the clerk's office who read him the summary. Dorothea's hand tightened slightly on the receiver.
Did they confirm the offset?
They confirmed everything, Cobb said. They pulled the original survey. They compared it to the amendment. They documented the coordinate difference. They documented the submission date. Cobb paused, the silence on the line thick with the weight of the victory. And they documented the file number of the submitting attorney. It bypassed the review step. The auditor put it in writing. Dorothea exhaled, a slow, controlled release of breath. The numbers had held. The geography of the city, the real geography, had been preserved on paper. Do you have a pen, Miss Oakes? Cobb asked. I always have a pen, Reverend. The attorney gave me the exact phrasing of the key line from the finding, Cobb said. I want you to hear it. Dorothea reached into her purse, which sat on the floor beside her chair. She bypassed her wallet and her keys, her fingers finding the familiar, slightly worn cover of her crossword puzzle booklet. She pulled it out and opened it to a puzzle she had completed 3 days ago during the height of Hasley's containment campaign. She uncapped her pen and pressed the tip to the blank margin of the page.
Go ahead,
she said. Cobb read the line slowly, his voice resonating with the formal, bureaucratic cadence of the auditor's office. The coordinate divergence noted in the East Corridor rezoning amendment, submitted under file reference 742A, does not correspond to any standard datum conversion and represents a material alteration of the surveyed boundary without documented authorization. Dorothea wrote the words down exactly as he spoke them. Her handwriting was small, precise, and perfectly legible. She did not miss a syllable. When she finished, she looked at the sentence in the margin of the crossword puzzle. It was a dry, technical string of words. To anyone else, it would mean nothing. To Dorothea, it was the sound of a steel door slamming shut on Conrad Hasley.
I have it,
Dorothea said. The attorney is moving immediately, Cobb told her. He is drafting a supplemental filing to the city council right now. He is citing the auditor's finding and formally requesting that the original surveyed boundary be reinstated as the operative corridor for any future rezoning application. He expects the council chair to place it on the agenda for the next session.
They have no choice now,
Dorothea said quietly.
The auditor made it a public record.
Exactly, Cobb said. I will be at the church this evening. Come by when you are finished with your shift. We need to discuss what happens next.
I will be there,
Dorothea said. She hung up the telephone. She looked down at the crossword booklet for a long time. She read the sentence she had just written, committing the file reference number to her photographic memory. Then she closed the booklet, returned it to her purse, picked up her wooden ruler, and went back to sorting the permits from 1950. Upstairs, the machinery was moving faster now. The civil rights attorney, a man who had spent the last decade fighting the city over segregated facilities and discriminatory zoning, did not waste the momentum. By 10:30 in the morning, his supplemental filing was hand-delivered to the city clerk's office. It was a masterclass in legal leverage. It did not accuse the city council of complicity. It merely offered them a way out. By citing the auditor's finding, the attorney gave the council chair the bureaucratic cover needed to kill the altered amendment without admitting that the council had almost ratified a fraud. The clerk stamped the supplemental filing received. By 11 o'clock, the council chair had officially placed the reinstatement of the original surveyed boundary on the agenda for the next legislative session. At exactly the same hour, a personnel officer from the City Attorney General's department walked out of the elevator on the third floor. He carried a single sheet of paper in a sealed blue envelope. He walked down the carpeted hallway, past the portraits of former mayors, and stopped at the open door of Conrad Hasley's office. The personnel officer knocked twice on the doorframe. There was no answer. He stepped into the office. The room was silent. The desk was perfectly clear, save for the telephone and a neat stack of blank legal pads. The seersucker jacket was not draped over the back of the chair. The personnel officer approached the desk. He knew Hasley's reputation. Everyone in the building knew Hasley's reputation. The man was an institution, a pillar of quiet competence. But the machinery of the city had no memory and no loyalty. When a gear broke, it was isolated and removed. The personnel officer checked his watch, noted the time on a clipboard, and placed the blue envelope squarely in the center of Hasley's pristine blotter. Inside the envelope was a formal notice of administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full internal review by the Attorney General's office. Hasley was barred from accessing city files, barred from contacting city personnel regarding active cases, and barred from entering the building without an escort. The personnel officer turned and walked out, leaving the notice sitting in the quiet, empty room. It was the first time in his 14-year tenure that Conrad Hasley had called in absent. The internal review began that afternoon. The Attorney General's office dispatched an investigator to the Planning and Zoning Department. The investigator did not go to the archive room. He did not ask for Dorothea Oakes. He went to the main clerk's room, walked past the rows of clattering typewriters, and stopped at the desk of Wallace Pruitt. Pruitt was 51 years old. He smelled, as he always did, of pipe tobacco and nervous sweat. He had worked in the zoning office for 19 years without a single formal complaint filed against him or by him. His entire existence was built on the principle of invisibility. He processed the queue. He did not ask questions. He intended to retire in 4 years with his pension intact. When the internal review officer asked Pruitt to step into a vacant conference room, Pruitt's hands trembled so badly he had to put his pen down to hide it. The interview lasted 45 minutes. The review officer sat across from Pruitt, a notebook open on the table. The officer asked about the intake process for the East Corridor rezoning amendment. He asked about the dates. He asked about the signatures. Pruitt sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the officer's tie clip. He knew he was trapped. He knew that Dorothea had seen him cover the file. He knew that Hasley was gone. The instinct for self-preservation, honed over 2 decades of bureaucratic survival, took over. "I processed the intake," Pruitt said, his voice thin and reedy. 2 weeks before the council vote. "Did you review the amendment against the original survey on file?" the officer asked. Pruitt swallowed hard. "Yes, that is standard procedure." "Did you note a discrepancy in the boundary coordinates?" Pruitt closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He thought of his pension. He thought of the 4 years he had left. "I noted a difference in the numbers, yes." "And what action did you take, Mr. Pruitt?" "I took no action," Pruitt said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The amendment was submitted directly by Mr. Hasley. He is a senior city attorney. He bypassed the standard review step, citing a deadline. I assumed it was a revision authorized by the submitting attorney. It is not my place to question the legal department's filings. I filed it as submitted." The review officer looked at Pruitt for a long time. The silence in the conference room was heavy, suffocating. The officer understood exactly what Pruitt was. A coward who had looked the other way because looking the other way was the safest thing to do. But cowardice was not a crime in Birmingham City Hall. It was a prerequisite for employment. The officer wrote Pruitt's statement down in his notebook. He recorded the acknowledgement of the discrepancy. He recorded the failure to escalate. He closed the notebook. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt," the officer said. "Return to your desk." Pruitt stood up, his knees weak, the smell of pipe tobacco clinging to his damp shirt. His employment was not immediately affected. He was not fired. He was not suspended. But the record of his statement was entered into the permanent file. He would survive, but he would survive knowing that his silence was now a matter of public record. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and stared blindly at the stack of intake forms in front of him. Dorothea Oakes was not formally interviewed by the Internal Review Officer. She was a junior clerk. The legal parameters of her actions had already been established by the civil rights attorney. She had made a legal copy of a public document. She had acted entirely within her access rights under Alabama public records practice. There was nothing to investigate. Late in the afternoon, the department head of planning and zoning walked into the archive room. He did not speak to Dorothea. He did not apologize for the reassignment. He simply walked to the filing cabinet behind her desk, opened her personnel folder, and removed the formal recommendation for termination that Hasley had filed. He tore the paper in half, dropped it into the wastebasket, and placed a brief typed note in the file stating that the personnel review had been withdrawn due to lack of cause. He closed the cabinet and walked out. Dorothea watched him leave. She gave no visible reaction. She picked up her ruler and continued her work. When the clock on the wall reached 5:15, Dorothea cleared her desk. She aligned her pens. She placed her ruler in the center drawer. She took her purse, turned off the archive room light, and left City Hall. She did not take the bus. She walked. The heat of the day was beginning to break, the harsh glare of the Alabama sun softening into a bruised, hazy twilight. She walked away from the heavy limestone architecture of the municipal district, moving eastward toward Greater Shiloh Baptist Church. The streets transitioned from government buildings to commercial storefronts, and then to the quieter, tree-lined avenues of the residential neighborhoods. The church was empty when she arrived. The sanctuary was dark, the stained glass windows muted from the outside. She walked around to the side entrance and let herself in. She navigated the familiar hallway to the administrative wing. A single bar of yellow light spilled from beneath the door of the pastor's study. Dorothea knocked once and opened the door. Reverend Matthias Cobb was sitting behind his heavy oak desk. He looked tired, the deep lines around his mouth more pronounced in the lamplight, but his eyes were sharp. He had his legal pad open in front of him, a ballpoint pen resting in his massive hand. "Miss Oakes," Cobb said, his baritone filling the small room. "Sit down." Dorothea sat in the same wooden chair she had occupied days earlier, when she had first recited the falsified numbers from memory. She placed her purse on her lap, keeping her posture straight. "Tell me," Cobb said. Dorothea recounted the sequence of the day. She spoke in complete, precise sentences, leaving nothing out. She told him about the auditor's finding being delivered. She told him about the administrative leave notice left on Hasley's empty desk. She told him about the council agenda item securing the original boundary. She told him about Pruitt's interview with the Internal Review Officer, which she had heard about through the quiet, rapid gossip of the clerk's room. As she spoke, the sound of Reverend Cobb writing on his legal pad filled the room, the soft scratch of a ballpoint on ruled paper, unhurried, in the quiet of the church office after the building had emptied. He wrote down every detail. He trusted documents, he trusted records, and he was making his own. When she finished, Cobb stopped writing. He looked at the page for a moment, then looked up at Dorothea. "What happens to the plant?" Cobb asked. "The original surveyed corridor is reinstated as the operative boundary," Dorothea explained, her voice steady. "The council will ratify the reinstatement at the next session. Caldwell Industrial cannot use the altered coordinates. If they want to proceed with the facility, they will have to build it adjacent to the Roebuck Park suburb, as originally surveyed. If they refuse that location, they will need to commission a completely new survey, submit a new application, and start the zoning process over from the beginning." Cobb nodded slowly. He understood the implications. The delay alone would cost Caldwell Industrial hundreds of thousands of dollars. The political exposure of trying to force the plant into a white suburb would likely kill the project entirely. The machine had been stopped. Cobb set down his pen. It clicked softly against the wood of the desk. "The community does not know your name yet," Cobb said, his voice dropping to a quieter register. "I have not told the deacons who found the discrepancy. The attorney has kept your identity out of the public filings. As far as the city council is concerned, this was an internal audit discovery prompted by a civil rights inquiry." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "Do you want that to change, Miss Oakes? Do you want them to know what you did?" Dorothea looked at the Reverend. She thought of the tacky adhesive under her kitchen table drawer where she had hidden the copy. She thought of Hasley standing in front of her desk, his voice perfectly calm as he threatened her livelihood. She thought of the way the department head had silently torn up her termination notice, erasing the conflict without ever acknowledging her humanity. "Not yet," Dorothea said quietly. Cobb tilted his head. "Why?" "Because I still work at City Hall," Dorothea said. "Conrad Hasley is gone, but the machine is still there. Wallace Pruitt is still there. The people who looked the other way are still there. If they know it was me, I become a target. I become a political problem. They will find a way to remove me." She adjusted her grip on her purse. "I am more useful to you and to Collegeville if I remain exactly where I am. A junior clerk who processes the paperwork, a woman who aligns her carbon copies, a woman who sees the numbers." Cobb stared at her for a long time. The respect in his eyes was absolute. He reached out and closed his legal pad. "You are a formidable woman, Dorothea Oakes," he said softly. "I am just a clerk, Reverend," she replied. "I just read what is on the page." Dorothea left the church a few minutes later. She did not go back to her apartment. She walked from the church to her mother's house in Collegeville. It was a 12-block journey, taking her deep into the neighborhood she had just saved from being suffocated by industrial exhaust. The evening had fully settled by the time she arrived. The streets of Collegeville were quiet, bathed in the warm, fading light of the street lamps. She walked up the cracked concrete path to her mother's house. The smell of the Collegeville porch in the evening was a complex, comforting anchor. Cut grass from a neighbor's yard where a mower had run earlier in the day, a faint trace of coal smoke from a chimney 2 houses down, even in summer, the faint sweetness of a gardenia bush blooming fiercely at the corner of the wooden steps. Her mother was sitting on the porch swing, a glass of iced tea resting on the railing. She looked up as Dorothea approached, her face breaking into a tired, familiar smile. "Dorothea," her mother said, "you're walking late." "I had an errand after work," Dorothea said. She climbed the steps and sat down on the top stair, resting her back against the wooden post. She looked out over the small front yard, toward the street, and beyond the houses to the open field at the edge of the neighborhood. The field where the metal stamping plant would have stood. The field that would remain empty, quiet, and safe. She did not tell her mother what she had done. She did not tell her about the photostat machine or the crossword booklet or the auditor's finding or Conrad Hasley's empty desk. The burden of that knowledge belonged to her alone. Her mother took a sip of her tea. The chains of the porch swing creaked softly in the evening air. "How has work been?" her mother asked casually. Dorothea looked at the gardenia bush. She felt the tension that had gripped her spine for the past week finally, completely, let go. "It has been a long week," Dorothea said. The machinery of the city took its time to finalize the correction. Approximately 2 weeks after Conrad Hasley was placed on administrative leave, the internal review finding was officially issued by the City Attorney General's office. The document was 60 pages long. It confirmed the falsification of the boundary coordinates beyond any shadow of a doubt. It detailed the timeline, the bypassed review steps, and the deliberate nature of the alteration. The Attorney General did not handle the discipline internally. The falsification of a public zoning document for the benefit of a private industrial contract crossed the line from administrative misconduct to criminal fraud. The internal review finding was formally referred to the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office. Whether criminal charges would follow remained pending. In Birmingham, Alabama, in 1971, the prosecution of a wealthy, connected white attorney was a complicated